People in identical monochrome uniforms hurried each other. There's not much time left. Children in cages around were sobbing heart-rendingly. Among them, a girl with pink hair was chosen. Her hands were cuffed. The light barely reached the corner where she sat with her knees bent. A man in uniform roughly pulled her out of the cage by the collar, paying her. He instructed her to stop crying and be more obedient, otherwise an unpleasant outcome would be obvious. To make it more convincing, he reminded the children what happened last time with the girl who tried to escape but was caught. Although the heroine did not have a clear enough idea about this, it seemed to her that she was already in hell. The voice was artificially expounding its speech. He asked if they remembered the villain who made absolutely everyone tremble with fear 7 years ago, focusing on the tragic ending of his fate. Then, after a pause, the voice rose theatrically, feeding the excitement of the auction participants. The next product is the daughter of the Duke of Hungary himself. If anyone here has unpaid debts to the Duke, this is a great opportunity that may never come again. Her father, the Duke of Hungary, had power in the Gurt Empire. 7 years ago, due to certain events, the Duke's family found itself in decline. The Duchess died in custody, and the Duke followed her. The rest of the family scattered in different directions. As soon as she was born, she was handed over to be raised by the Duke's subordinate, Count Siemund. At first, everything was moderately good. The Count paid her enough attention. But as soon as the news of her father's death reached him, everything immediately changed. A child of noble birth was bullied and forced to serve as indentured servants. Unable to bear it, she ran away, but was caught and beaten until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she realized that she was imprisoned by slave traders. This was her path to this auction. Different bets poured in from all sides. Higher and higher, 50,000, 65,000, then 100. The girl stood clutching the hem of her dress. In her head, there were only thoughts about how she had had enough of this life. Suddenly, someone bet $1 million, then 4 more on top. Total, $5 million for a 7-year-old child. It was a young man in a cloak with a hood. Half of his face was covered with a mask. He sat uninvolved, resting his head on his hand. No one named the price higher, considering him not particularly smart. The auction winner has been selected. He asked the girl's name, but she didn't have a name, and then carefully removed the handcuffs from her. There were bruises on my arms from the heavy shackles. She was told not to move so as not to get hurt. Following this, a blue power shone around her wrists. There were 3 conditions. Cahilb Simond will take care of Hungary's 4th child, for which the earldom will receive support from the Duke. He would name the child with all his love and make sure the Duke's daughter was safe until he saw her. Screams and blows were heard behind the door. He threw off his cloak, revealing a skillfully tailored uniform. The young man says that it was on these 3 demands that the agreement with the Count was concluded 7 years ago, but now it has been terminated. The man in uniform promises to investigate and bring to justice all those who forced the Duke's daughter to end up here at the auction organized by the slave traders. Behind the door stood 2 ranks of bloodied knights. He walked forward between them and ordered to destroy this place and burn all the remains. In the middle of the road he turned around, waiting for her to follow him. After hesitating a little, the heroine nevertheless steps forward. 7 years ago, the heroine was reborn as a child without a name from a novel she wrote in a past life. She was taken from hell itself and became the daughter of a duke, a man who was considered the highest evil in the empire. The man in the uniform turned out to be the Duke of Hungary himself. He brought the girl to her technical home, that is, to the duchy. Also, she was given several rules, including being polite and behaving ethically in the presence of her father, because he hates annoying people. Although the heroine would turn 7 this year, she looked much smaller and thinner than her peers. The Duke ordered the servants to wash, dress, and feed the girl so that she would soon feel better. The Duke himself goes to the capital for a short time. He needs to clean up the mess created there while he was dead. He expresses his hopes that his daughter will be better when he returns. When the door slammed behind the Duke, the heroine could breathe out calmly. She was terribly nervous. This world is the universe of the novel she wrote when she was in school. In a past life, after completing her education, she immediately got a job in a small company. It seemed to her that she seemed to be the concentration of everything unpleasant that a person can experience while working in an office. All she got was powerlessness, depression, and self-hatred. While wearing a toga, she quit her job at the company, but then died due to hypothermia. She drank after several refusals at an interview and fell asleep on the street in the cold. Servants scurried around looking for their lady. She accidentally ran away from them. On a subconscious level, she developed a sense of danger when she is surrounded by a large crowd of people. This dates back to the time of the terrible attitude of the servants at the Count's estate towards the girl. They could hit, kick, or scream at her as much as they wanted. Having discovered the girl behind the column, who was covering her ears trying to be as invisible as possible, they behaved softly and carefully. One of the women accidentally remembered a crispy apple pie that would soon cool down, which attracted the child's attention. Also about sweet peach tartlet with whipped cream and honey syrup, butter chicken, and roast turkey. And for dessert, there will be chocolate chip cookies and lemon macaroons. She had to cover her mouth with her hands so as not to make a sound, because this undoubtedly made an impression on the child. Unlike the servants in the Count's estate, this woman loomed over her like an angel with the words that this house is hers, and they are her servants. And if she does not like to let them in, she can order them to disappear from her eyes. She gently asked if her lady could come out of her hiding place behind the column if that was not the case. The girl carefully crawled out, trying to explain that it wasn't that she didn't like them. Thanks to these words, the servants blossomed before their eyes. One of them invited her to go eat some delicious food right now. Looking at the hand extended to her, the heroine involuntarily remembered the behavior of the other servants with her. She made a comment to herself about how terrible she smelled. In response, the woman sat down and touched her arm, trying to make her feel more comfortable. She smiled and replied that it was not surprising, because the lady was outside, so her suggestion was to just go to the bathroom first. The bath was luxuriously warm and spacious. There was a chandelier with an abundant scattering of crystals on the ceiling, candles were burning around, and the sun was pouring through a huge stained glass window onto the entire wall. It seemed to the girl that everyone in this estate was quite kind, unlike the inhabitants of the Count's dark estate. But they all exaggerated a little, especially when she wanted to do something on her own, like take a bath. The servants who entered were surprised that the heroine had cleaned the bathroom, to such an extent that the room was shining. Then they saw the scars on her shoulders. They randomly overlapped one another, forming a pattern of peculiar crosses. They shouted over each other. One said that if the lady didn't like the things, they could of course bring others. Another suggested moving to another room for convenience, and another one noted that you need to dry your hair first. Before this, the heroine's hair was scattered in disarray over her shoulders. Through the persistence of the servants, the girl's appearance took on more of the traits of a lady of noble birth. The hair was neatly combed and secured with bows. They offered a choice of several different colors, as well as a couple of types of brooches. When they finished with the outfit, the heroine was seated at a table overflowing with treats. Several desserts, a chocolate brownie, and a row of colorful macarons. The girl happily ate on both cheeks, which pleased the servants. Even though it was literally their responsibility to take on the job and take care of her needs, she couldn't help but thank them. When she went to bed at night, she thought about whether it was all a dream or not. After all this made her happy. Will she be able to live like this in the future? The only thing she is sure of is that if this is all a dream, then she doesn't want to wake up. In the morning, a maid came in whose name was Faina. To the outrage of the other employees, she wanted to give the lady a tour of the estate. The girls, with great disappointment, tried to insist on the injustice since they also went to accompany the lady, but they answered that if they were dissatisfied, they should be promoted. Everything was decorated with gold. The third floor, the dining room. When they came out through the door, it turned out to be a garden with marble columns and lilacs. It bloomed regardless of the time of year thanks to magic. In the distance, a shining building could be seen. It was a glass greenhouse. Everything inside is decorated with glass and precious stones. Next, they entered the exhibition hall. There, in addition to other examples of art, there also hung a portrait of the Duke's family with 3 sons. The heroine remembered that she also had a family in the real world, but instead of love, she received cruelty and insults from them. Faina drew attention to the saddened look of the girl. She smiled and said that she could calmly tell her about her thoughts. The heroine looked at the portrait again, asking a question about her brothers. The eldest lord of the House of Hungary went on a campaign to destroy the stigmata. The middle one studies at the Imperial Academy, and the youngest, in turn, received a special blessing during the awakening ceremony. Now he is in the tower to learn how to control it. The heroine was discouraged by this. In a world where all the gods have fallen and ceased to exist, the blessing is a power given by the seers known as the guardian stars. And the ritual of receiving blessings is called the awakening ceremony. Stigmata are monsters of this world, generated by the curse of the last god, and their representative is known as the king of the stigmata. The thought arises in her head about the similarities between the king of the stigmata and the final boss after Henrietta. The Duke has a blessing similar to the final boss's power. The gentleman received it from a gray-eyed woman with a pole. According to rumors, he acquired all the magical knowledge and powerful abilities. I received a blessing from my guardian star not to freeze or get sick. Faina received from her guardian star not to freeze or get sick, and the heroine was interested in what blessing she would receive. The maid asked how the girl was feeling, and in response, she could not help but thank the woman who showed so much kindness as she did today, when she showed so many beautiful places. It couldn't help but touch the first one. Every time, as if for the first time, seeing the lady's modest smile and the sparkle in her eyes. The butler entered the gallery, looking for the lady, to announce that the gentleman had returned. The speed of his return discouraged Faina. The man noticed that for some reason he felt uneasy. The girl was sitting on the bed and dangling her legs where the maid had left her, asking her to wait a little. After some time, she decided that she needed to go check and set off along the corridors. The walls of the estate were alive with whispers about the Duke. Someone heard that he could not sleep properly in the capital, so everyone had to observe deathly silence while he slept. Others received news that this time he was under threat of an attempt on his life, so it would be worth strengthening the security of his possessions. One thing was obvious. He spread rumors about his own death in order to identify the traitor. And everyone agreed that this would certainly happen. The heroine was testing. I'm worried about this state of affairs. She decided to return to her room as soon as possible so that no one would notice her. But suddenly, she realized that she didn't understand where she had wandered. Wandering along unfamiliar corridors, she came across doors behind which was some kind of laboratory. Colorful liquids bubbled in the colas in the dim light. Dried herbs hung on the ceiling. Figures resembling ghosts loomed over the girl. There were no legs under the hem of their clothes. He monotonously said that the lady should not walk here, which frightened her even more than the huge sealed spider on the shelf. Without knowing the direction, she ran into the distance with loud screams and a look of primal horror on her face. Having barely calmed her breathing, the heroine looked around and realized that she was in an incredibly beautiful garden. Faina mentioned this place. The ceilings were skillfully made of glass, indicating that she was in a glass greenhouse. Walking steadily forward, she noticed a lake. Something sparkled in it, and the girl got close to the water to see what it was. Suddenly, hands appeared from the water, an unnatural pale color. And there was a huge number, grabbing her in different places. The child was pulled into the water before she even had time to come to her senses. The hands pulled her deeper and deeper into the water. Fuzzy voices were heard, barely audible like the sound of waves. They repeated the name Henrietta syllable by syllable, shouting that it had come, not understanding why it was here. Suddenly she found herself on the surface and fell to the ground, coughing heavily. It was painful. Water was dripping from her in streams. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, and it was driving her crazy. The man who saved her turned out to be a boy, looking her age. He gently touched his shoulder, asking if everything was okay, and if they told her not to go into this place. The heroine began to sob from an overabundance of emotions, although the boy was confused at first by this. Then he extended his hands to her, assuring her that he just wanted to help and would not do anything bad to her. He touched his index finger to her forehead. From the point of contact, magical energy with blue reflections was formed. The sensation was more refreshing than cold. When the boy finished, his sleeves became wet. He curtsied carefully, politely saying that he was glad to meet you. Also, smiling dazzlingly. The heroine was surprised at how happy he was, even though they had just met. He introduced himself as a guest of this estate, and, without unnecessary objections, led her by the hand, agreeing to show the way to the heroine, who was lost. His hands were surprisingly cold, even though she was the one who had just been underwater. They walked along an area densely planted with trees and other bright greenery. He asked how old she was, and when he heard the number 7, he realized that she was the daughter of the Duke whom he was looking for. This did not inspire confidence in the heroine, because the Duke was released from prison 2 years ago and only now found her, who had experienced cruelty and torment all this time. When the boy raised his head, he said that they had arrived. The room resembled the style of other rooms of the estate, the same walls richly decorated with gold elements, a complex composition of patterns, and a lot of lighting. She shook her head, not understanding. How could this happen? Just now they were in the greenhouse, and now they suddenly found themselves in this room. Even more unexpected was the complete dryness of her clothes, and especially her hair, as if she had never fallen into the lake. The boy pointed to the door ahead. Opening it, she entered a room with dim light. Someone's office, as indicated by a kind of table, pens, books, and other personal belongings. But it definitely wasn't her room. A tired voice was heard from behind. He announced that he knew she was there, and noticed that now she didn't bother him, even because of such trifles. The girl immediately recognized the timbre. Obviously, she had ended up in the Duke's room, in the realization of which she was covered with a new wave of horror. She realized that she could not move. Her body froze in one position. Her pupils were wildly dilated, and her lungs refused to work. The Duke approached slowly, blade ready. The girl in tears realized her mistake. The Duke is a villain who has no pity for himself or others, and she should have been more careful. Struggling to speak clearly, she fell to her knees, asking, or rather pleading, for forgiveness. Seeing her face, the Duke put down the blade, calling her a little mouse, but he thought it was a killer who had sneaked in, and he was already going to cut off all the limbs of the uninvited guest. He added, by the way, was it Count Salmond who taught her to ask for forgiveness like that when she had done something wrong, obviously looking not particularly pleased with such behavior? The Duke sat her down in a chair and asked her what she had learned during her time in Salmond County. If you remember, the inhabitants of Hungarian County are usually very capable, but his daughter's skills were rather primitive. She could read, write, and keep simple numbers. The Duke's mood was getting worse. If you think about it, she is his own daughter. Perhaps that is why he cares. In desperate attempts to prove her usefulness, because she wanted to stay in this estate, the girl noticed her other subtle skills. Salmond County, a willingness to carry out various assignments, routine things, and mentally added that, in addition, in her previous life, she lived desperately in this one. The Duke asked if she had read Aulante. Her face turned red, and the answer was that no, but she had heard about it. He put the book back and went on to mention the harpsichord, a musical instrument that is similar to a piano. The girl carefully answered that she was not familiar with this, but if there was a book she could read it. The Duke crossed his arms and looked at her for a few moments. This was enough to see her swaying in her chair, incredibly tired. The room flashed before her eyes with tattered pictures until she almost fell out of her chair. He picked her up by the scruff of the neck and walked a little in this position, throwing her on his bed and saying that she needed to sleep first. Half asleep, the heroine tried to find the strength to act rationally, to say that she would now return to her room, but feeling so tired, she was still more inclined to think that it was too hard for her today. While she was in the grip of a sound sleep, the Duke removed numerous ornaments from her hair and allowed her small valley to rest in his, simply sitting and observing her. Outside, the rain was pouring and lightning was streaking the sky. She abruptly woke up from the nightmare. A dark, ephemeral hand reached forward. A cry was heard that repeated only one word, no. The hands held the sword blade down, swinging to deliver a crushing blow. A drop of blood fell into a whole red lake. There was a lot of noise around, as if she was in a closed, cramped room. The girl, opening her eyes, saw an unfamiliar ceiling, which is why she quickly jumped up and sat down on the bed, trying to understand where she was. The Duke, who at that moment appeared in front of the bed, frightened her. She remembered that yesterday she got lost, but how she could not fall asleep while talking with him still could not fit into her head. The first thing he said was to give him his hand. He raised 2 fingers to her without touching. In this space an energy was formed, similar to the magic of that boy, blue in color, refreshing. It settled on the heroine's wrist, moving onto her hand, in the form of circles from the center of which a large number of rays emerged. Seeing her confusion about this, he began to explain, being dissatisfied that the servants had not done this earlier. The estate is enchanted, so strangers who do not have a mark wander here, unable to find the right road or exit. The girl understood why, no matter where she went, she always ended up in strange places, and eventually, in the Duke's room. Her room is on the opposite side, 3rd floor, on the right along the corridor. He called the servants to accompany the heroine and asked her to come to him after dinner, since he still had questions for her. She carefully walked out the door, still not having recovered from the feelings of yesterday's disorientation, Faina, Maylie, and Celia were waiting for her, and they immediately ran up. Faina apologized because she should have warned the lady about this, but in fact, she thought that she would always be by her side. The heroine believed that this was partly her fault, since she did not need to leave like that without telling anyone anything. When the maids learned that she had received the mark, it caused a stir. The young masters did not receive it until they were 10 years old. Apparently, the gentleman cares about the young lady very much. Hearing that the lady needed to meet her father after dinner, they immediately took her to the bathroom, talking with each other. Would she like to use the same bath products as last time? The new dress they ordered also arrived. The Duke of Hungary was sitting at the table in his office, dressed in a uniform with brooches of honor. Yesterday, the heroine told him that she remembers everyone who visited Count Samand. Now he asked her to tell her in more detail. Then she sat in a meeting room among people she did not know, most likely of high position. It seemed to her that with their glances, these people could form holes in her skull. The Duke reduced all conversations and misunderstandings about the heroine's presence here into silence with one word. He ordered that they listen to the proposal before they began, and ask all questions after. The girl squeezed the fabric of her dress, frantically assuring herself that she would definitely cope. She started with the topic they talked about a few days ago. Baron Damien visited the Earl's house. Baron Anthony and Earl Paulford were also present. When she remembered the topic of their conversations back then, the characteristic sound of hunger was heard. This amused those present, who chuckled quietly into their ears and their fans. Usually, every 2 hours she has a snack, and she cited a well-known fact about the rapidity of depletion of a child's body in order to relieve her own awkwardness, because the muttering did not stop, and her face flushed red. The Duke noticed that even in such a situation she was hungry and ordered tea and sweets to be immediately brought, that is, exactly what, in his opinion, children eat. Because of this, she wanted to fall into the ground even more. A meeting is taking place, and he tells her to eat. The Duke did not understand why she did not eat, so he put down his pen and tried the strawberries from her dish himself, thereby making sure that the food was not poisoned. He pushed the plate back to the child, saying that there was no problem, she could eat in peace. Of course, the reason that she didn't touch the food was different, but after that, her soul felt better. The girl and her father were sitting in the middle of the garden. He pushed a cake towards her, saying to sit down. On the faces of the maids, at the sight of this, one could read a mixture of surprise and tenderness at this spectacle, and the heroine herself was not at all against this, although there was some misunderstanding. After that day, the Duke regularly came and was the first to taste the food. She felt uncomfortable and calm about it. He pushed another plate towards her, telling her to try this too. The heroine tried her best to hold her face. Of course she was quite uncomfortable, but everything looked so delicious. When she lived in Salmon County, she was called only when food had to be tested for poison. Even though the poison was not fatal, it caused enough suffering. Now he tries everything first, saying that the food is safe, and then just eating it. Perhaps he realized that deep down she was simply afraid to eat. Come to think of it, she's his daughter, and that's probably the reason he cares. She was also worried if there was poison in the food, but the maid said that the master was protected by magic, and poison was not afraid of him, surprising her concern about such things. The Duke informed her that they would go to see the orchard tomorrow, and she should be ready for the day. He added that it was better for her to inspect the land in advance, which would soon become her property. While the maids were combing the lady's hair for bed, she seemed to float far away. She asked Faina if she was there, and what kind of place it was after hearing that the maid blossomed before her eyes. About the Duke's assistant, she heard that the lady was talking so enthusiastically about the orchard, although in fact, she was then simply assigned to Shady, the Count's daughter. This prompted the heroine to think that perhaps she herself, without realizing it, made her father understand that this was one of her few pleasant memories. At the same time, she realized that lately she had begun to appreciate life, and that unlike memories, the instincts of a child tend to take over her body and mind, and she should be more careful. Lying in bed, it was difficult for her to fall asleep, although this was not even any errand, but just a walk. Her heart was beating wildly from excitement. Pulling the blanket to her nose, she could only think about it while looking at the ceiling. The maids scurried around her room, worrying that if the lady did not fall asleep now, it would be difficult for her to get up tomorrow. One of them expressed the idea that even this is good, because she was worried that the girl would even say that she was scared. Faina also noticed that it was wonderful that the gentleman took more care of his daughter than she thought. During the report that the lady was injured, she was very scared that she even thought she was going to die. Suddenly, the Duke appeared behind them and asked what they were doing here. The maids tried to quickly bow out, saying that the lady had recently fallen asleep, but the master ordered them to follow him on an errand. The heroine looked out the window in fascination. She, along with the Duke and Faina, were riding in a carriage on the way to the garden. The maid, inspired by the lady's happiness, announced that very soon they would pass the magic gate and be there. The flower beds around were planted with tulips. The girl could not hold back her scream of delight. A gray-haired man in a beret rushed towards them, meeting a gentleman who had already arrived. The Duke told her to take the servants and inspect everything, since he had business to do. Her mood, despite the excitement earlier, was so high that she did not stop smiling. The garden is located to the north of their domain. They say the climate here is regulated by magic. There were a lot of ripe fruits on the trees. She picked them and showed Faina blue butterflies around the flowers in the flower bed. On the way here, Henriette told her that his sons had already divided the property between themselves. Ownership rights were also transferred to them, and management rights would be personally issued by the Duke when they were older. The gray-haired man brought the horse that the gentleman had prepared for the heroine and asked if she would like to ride. Faina carefully held her on horseback so that the lady would not fall. Then she fed the horse directly from her hands, and the man told her more about the garden, proudly pointing out these views. A dog came running to the girl and immediately began to lick her cheeks, which the heroine found touching. They ran around the fountain together for some time, until Faina's cry invited her to a meal because it was already time to eat. Sandwiches and cakes were laid out on the bedspread. Among this, there were strange cookies on one plate. Faina, in a whisper, explained that the gentleman had prepared them himself, which led the heroine into confusion. Were his thoughts too radical? The business he had with the maids yesterday turned out to be a question of what simple recipe he could prepare. Because his daughter will not eat food that he does not give her. His chain of thoughts looked like, if she eats well, then I give it to her, then she only eats what I give her, then I have to cook it myself. He sat waiting for her verdict. Having tasted his cookies, the girl tried her best to keep a smiling face. The taste was difficult to describe with a softer word than destructive. She still felt uncomfortable eating alone, so she handed one of the treats to the Duke, asking him to try it because it was very tasty. Having accepted the donut handed to him, the Duke plunged into thought. In total, he had 3 sons and a daughter. The elder Avel avoided him, Camillon ran away, and Calix, as soon as he saw him, immediately began to cry. But this child seemed completely different to him, with his attentiveness and certain signs of care characteristic of the relationship between father and daughter. This brought a small smile to his face. On the way back to the estate, in the carriage, the Duke asked if the orchard had gotten better, affectionately calling her baby. The heroine enthusiastically described how delicious the fruits were and how impressed she was by the local beauty. In her story, she mentioned a glass greenhouse, which surprised her father. The girl explained that her visit there was only a consequence of the lack of a mark because of which she got lost. Henriette instructed not to go there again if possible, because this place is not at all for admiration. Dangerous things lurk in the depths of the greenhouse. The stigmata are sealed inside the lake. Only he can enter it, since the ban does not apply to him. This information surprised the heroine, because despite his words, she calmly went inside. And besides, there was a boy there, a certain guest, which made the mystery of the greenhouse more and more confusing. Men in tailcoats gathered in a gray, unpretentious estate. Influential persons. One of them, unable to contain his anger, hit the table with his fist, shouting at the others. He felt as if he was shouting into the void, because no one seemed to give the danger of the situation its due. It was Count Evelyn. They asked the ego to calm down, but he continued trying to somehow get it into their heads. How can he be calm? In just a few days, half the faction was attacked, and the most significant places were attacked. The next remark was addressed to Count S. Eamon, since only those associated with him were attacked. This looks very suspicious, since nothing happened to him himself. Perhaps he conspired and is passing on information about them. One of those present tried to cut them off. They had not gathered here to argue, but the rest did not agree on whether a neutral position regarding the situation had been adopted. Even so, they listened to the Baron's opinion, so they need to pay more attention to his words, and find out everything properly. And Count Seaman must prove his innocence. The Count's hand involuntarily clenched. He mentally cursed Henrietta Hungary. Hearing about the death of the Duke, he immediately changed sides, but the truth reached him too late. In the midst of all this, it was hard not to wonder if he had suspected the Count from the very beginning. Still, he entrusted his daughter to him. Salmond was going to get rid of the girl, setting everything up for a kidnapping, but the auction failed that very same day, and this couldn't be a coincidence. The Duke's estate, in contrast to the past, was replete with architectural solutions that made the composition of the building dynamic and voluminous. Light stone, golden window frames, a huge number of details, from the fine carving of stone slabs to the variety of figures at the junction of the walls and roof. The heroine sat in a room with human-sized windows and drew. She looked at her drawings skeptically, noticing minor inaccuracies. The estate has strict restrictions on the games a lady can play alone. Therefore, recently she has become addicted to drawing. After racking her brains a little over her work, she came up with the idea of going to the exhibition hall, where there were a bunch of paintings on the basis of which it would be easier to analyze her mistakes. And she's had a mark for a long time, so she can move around calmly. First of all, she drew attention to the portrait of her parents and 3 brothers, taking this as a model for how to draw. She looked at the faces of still little boys on the canvas. The servant said they would return to the estate very soon. In the novel she wrote, all 3 of them had terrible personalities and a villainous aura. But living with the Duke, she realized that he was not as scary as he seemed, so she hoped that it would be the same with her sons. She left the hall, walking along the corridor, immersed in her thoughts about the fact that all this should be written down so as not to forget. Suddenly, an otherworldly voice, and more than one, sent a shiver down her skin. Around her hovered servants without legs, whose hems of their clothes were translucent. She rushed forward at a run, with her eyes closed. Although she knew that it was just sooty ghosts who signed a contract with the Duke's family, but a ghost is a ghost. In any case, it scared the child. The ghostly servants tried to help the lady, endlessly apologizing for the suddenness of their conversations, asking not to run away so quickly in as soft a tone as possible. But she rushed into the distance. She ran under barely audible snatches of the servants' words. "It's dangerous. There's a cliff there. Something else." She didn't pay much attention to their warnings, simply trying to avoid any contact with them. Raising her head, she found herself on a bridge in the middle of the garden. The heroine stopped only when she realized that it had become very quiet. She moved deeper into the greenery, trying to decipher their warnings as if they were hieroglyphs. All that was visible around was just a harmless garden. The intuitively chosen direction led her to an apple tree with incredible apples that seemed to glow among the foliage. A boy's voice was heard. He asked if she was lost again, and then he appeared among them, sitting on a branch. She immediately recognized him, by his red eyes, by the calm expression on his face. It was he who then pulled her out of the lake full of strange hands that pulled her to the depths. His posture was completely relaxed and carefree as he looked down at her. The servant in purple, bowing his head, brought the Duke the results of the investigation he asked for. He handed Henrietta a rather voluminous folder with a bunch of painted sheets. He reported that there had recently been a meeting at the estate of Baron Alfer, where Count Salmond was also present, which was verified personally. A recent conversation between him and the heroine surfaced in the Duke's head about how the Count never gave her a name, since this cannot be treated irresponsibly. Henriette, after a moment of thought, nevertheless put the reports on the table and asked where Baby was now, as he had developed the habit of calling her. At this time, in the garden, the heroine answered the boy that she was not lost at all. He replied nonchalantly and took a bite of that incredible-looking apple. The girl, watching this, realized that she was very hungry and hoping that he did not understand the same thing. She politely asked him for 1 apple, but in response, she heard that it was his. Next, the heroine decided to appeal by saying that the apple tree belonged to the Duke, that is, on this basis, she, as his daughter, could give her words more influence. The boy's next words were even more discouraging. He said that this might as well be considered his success, since he is a close associate of the Duke. She froze, processing this information, but he laughed quietly into his palm, which betrayed his deception. He asked her to open the hem of her dress wider and come a few steps closer, still sharing the apples with her. The fruits fell directly into the fabric of the dress, remaining safe and sound. Up close, they looked no worse than in the sun. The boy jumped from the tree and handed her an apple, which, as it seemed to him, was the most delicious and ripe, with a smile on his face. The children ate these apples together, hiding in the cool shade of a tree. He remembered that he forgot to ask what her name was last time, but she didn't have a name yet, and according to him, the boy's name was too long and difficult to pronounce. With a deft movement, the apple made a revolution in the air and ended up in his hand again. For these reasons, he asked to be called simply Kian. This puzzled the girl. In the novel she wrote, she did not remember a character with that name. Perhaps this is a minor person who was not particularly important, but the incident at the lake contradicted this theory. She tried to approach it carefully, starting with the phrase that the name was obviously not imperial, and continuing, asking a question, as if, by the way, about that meeting of theirs on the lake. But when the heroine looked, in the place where he stood leaning against the tree, there was emptiness. Instead, the already familiar nickname, Baby, rang out. The Duke approached from behind, without giving any clear answer to any of his questions. Without anger, he reproached her that it was almost lunchtime, and she was eating apples to satisfy her appetite. Then the heroine made the usual gesture, and invited him to try it, because it was delicious. A servant rushing towards them as fast as he could, he said that Count Samand had paid a visit. The realization of this knocked the apple out of the girl's hands. The impressions of the time he provided her with were still quite fresh. Moreover, even if she reveals information about the Count, in her expectations, there was never really an opportunity to see him again. Her first thought was that even if they met again, he would no longer be able to treat her randomly. This was a misconception. The Count ran up and desperately hugged her, emphasizing his concern, scolding her for disappearing like that, and yet he was looking for her. She couldn't even move. The Duke remained completely unmoved by these heartbreaking scenes. He rebuked the Earl's folly, saving face even as Seaman continued to insist on harboring warm feelings for the lady and genuine concern for her welfare. The rain poured down, and the conversation moved inside the living room with dark walls and lots of gold accents. Henriette stopped the Count's attempts to press further on the emotional aspect of the matter, expressing himself clearly and concisely. He demanded an explanation, since apparently the lady had a bad life in his house. The Count showed an incredibly wide range of emotions, making a more sacrificial face with every word and exclaiming all the time. Does his accusation lie in the fact that the lady, from his point of view, silently left and was then caught? He asked in a blatantly offended tone. The Duke's arguments were clear. At her age, the heroine is still not taught to write, read, or play musical instruments. The signs of hard work are obvious on the body, and the hair and skin, in turn, are clearly not looked after at all. Salmon tried to explain this as clearly as possible. In his version, the priority was always the lady's health rather than her education, and it was playing outside that caused her scars. About the servants, they were ignorant, and he admits that they behaved rudely, but they were immediately dismissed, and the girl herself showed interest in the things that the servants use. Her body didn't listen. It was as if she was in a vacuum, simply frozen and looking at one point. It was all a lie, she should have said it. She repeated it to herself an inaudible number of times, but could not make a sound. The Count suggested asking the lady herself about this. She would confirm his every word. Just one look in Simon's face revived a colorful picture from her memories, where she was beaten in the face for looking at him and then punished again. This made her, almost unconsciously, like a trained pet, respond to the command and obediently answer whatever he wished, lowering her head. She couldn't do anything else, feeling an inarticulate fear. The Count was delighted at the simple solution to this issue. He commented that she felt much better after being with the Duke a little. After all, her own father. This is her own father. With every word, he spoke more and more strange absurdity. According to him, the lady was probably just jealous of her daughter, that she lived with her own father, and wanting to attract attention, she invented something that didn't exist. He spiced it up with a remark about the charm of such lies at this age. Turning his head, the Duke saw that the heroine was sitting, not daring to move at all, only looking dejectedly at one point. He ordered the servants to take her to the room, because she looked tired. Once inside her walls, she immediately wrapped her head in a blanket, trying to build a wall of it around herself. The servants were surprised. Had she really gone to bed already? But the girl could not stop trembling about anxiety. She would have told the truth if not for the presence of the Duke. As it turned out, the fear she felt conveyed to him was much stronger than she thought. The Count took his leave, promising to meet and talk later. He was overcome by various thoughts. If he had known that this would happen, he would undoubtedly have killed her earlier. The servant led him through the corridors of the estate. He just liked to watch how the girl groveled in front of him, looking with the same eyes as the Duke's. He was going to leave her until the awakening ceremony, but now there is no point in pretending. It was raining in the middle of the night sky, almost like a downpour. The heroine's sleep was disturbed by otherworldly voices. They asked with all sincerity, nevertheless, to listen to them. First, jumping up on the bed, she was caught off guard by these translucent entities above her bed. But then, she gathered the strength to talk. After what she experienced when meeting with the Count, she was no longer so scared. The ghosts, of course, wanted to tell the master, but it seems that they are tied to a certain place from where they cannot leave. They can only remain in this form for a limited time, which means during this time there is no one other than her who can listen to them. They pointed down a dark corridor where two figures were talking. It was Count Salmond, who was laying out something like a plan to a man in a cook's uniform. The girl thought she had seen him before. Only fragments of their phrases reached her. The coral recipe, obligations, and the imperial palace were mentioned there. Suddenly she made an unnecessary, careless noise, which attracted the attention of those talking. Asking for forgiveness, the ghost servants placed her in a strange sphere, thanks to which she could fly up like a real ghost, and the Count discovered a void in the place where the heroine had just been. In the morning, while the servants were combing her hair, she recalled this adventure, comparing the sensations to a roller coaster. Still, she needed to discuss this with her father, since the Count was obviously planning something. Salmon spoke about coral, but after thinking a little, she finally remembered. It is a medicinal herb that acts as a poison on the body by blocking mana in the human body. It has a special aroma, so it requires a special cooking method to remove it. She wrote about this in her novel, although she was assured that there was nothing to worry about since the Duke was protected by magic. She immediately jumped out of her chair when she remembered that the man was Henrietta's personal chef and rushed off, not paying attention to anything around her. If he bribed the chef to use coral, it would be too late. The Duke is in danger even before the Count arrives. Of course, Henriette is a villain. This can be clearly seen in his proposals to simply destroy everything. Soon a hero should appear who will compete with the antagonists. However, opening the door to the Duke's room at full speed and asking to listen to her, she clearly remembered that she considered him to be her father. The Duke she met turns out to be radically more gentle than the character she wrote. She wanted to keep him safe. Her attempts to explain sounded awkward, ghosts and the like. Nevertheless, the girl got to the point of what she knew under the attentive silence of the Duke. Count Simon spoke with the chef about coral. If successful, he will notify the imperial palace. The heroine didn't know how to end it. She just awkwardly insisted that he should be more careful. The Duke asked if the food preparations were finished and ordered that Simon be called almost forcefully to the table, paying no attention to his desire to eat alone. He told the girl to follow him. The meagerness of his reaction puzzled her. There were doubts whether Henriette believed her words at all, after what the Count had said yesterday. Salmon wasted no time in making polite remarks, as if he were having a real small talk. He thanked the Duke for taking care of his breakfast and asked about the quality of the heroine's sleep at night. She sat in confusion, not understanding what to do in this situation. The Duke acknowledged the correctness of the Count's words. It seems his daughter wanted to attract attention, so she lied, which prompted the second to draw conclusions. She probably managed to tell Henrietta a lot. She should get rid of him quickly. The servants brought in several trays of food. A plan immediately formed in the heroine's head. She couldn't let this happen. As soon as the table was set, she should knock over the Duke's plate. Perhaps this will anger him, but still, this is a necessary measure. But suddenly, dishes were set for the Count. The Duke continued, if his daughter's words were false, let Salmon prove it by eating all the food he had prepared for the day. Because of this, he turned noticeably pale. His eyes widened in fear, looking at the shrimp laid out in front of him. The first, the second, obviously food meant for the whole day. He looked so frightened that his mask completely fell off. He also did not touch food. In the room, knights lined up behind the Count, obviously making the situation even more aggravated for him. In response to Henrietta's question about if the girl's words were lies, what was the reason why he did not eat, Salmond accepted his attempts to get out of a difficult situation with a pathetic attempt to insist that he did not eat vegetables. Against fear and with sweaty, tightly clenched hands, the heroine shouted, cutting off any of his arguments with just one word, feeling her father's trust. She directly accused the Count of pressing the order to mix coral into the food and denied any accusations of her lying. This angered Salmond, but the Duke immediately gave the order to capture the idiot who could not even teach his daughter etiquette. He will personally lead the interrogation, and in the meantime the Count will be locked in the dungeon, and everyone associated with the Simon family, including the cook, will be taken into custody. Screaming and leaning, he was nevertheless brought out through the efforts of several knights. The Count was captured on suspicion with the intention of killing Henrietta, of course. As a result, he will be punished for treason. The Duke asked the heroine what kind of punishment she wanted to endure. This caused her to be puzzled, so he explained that he was ready to listen to suggestions, if there were any, because she had the right to impose whatever punishment she considered best. But her answer was a request to judge him according to the law. The Duke calmly accepted this, promising to do as she wished. He still needed to know more about what was going on in the county, so she might be free, but they would talk some more later. The servants fussed around the heroine, who sat quietly on the sofa and tried to moderate their violent reaction to the situation. The girls considered her an incredible fellow, for the way she actually saved the Duke, almost accomplished a feat. In their usual manner, they showered enthusiastic comments on each other's interruptions. Although the heroine learned about this late, she can only talk to the signs at a certain time. From when the sun has set to before it has risen. The servants said that perhaps she heard the voices of ghosts because magic was not high. They say she got it from her father and mother. So much happened during this day. She was finding it difficult to sleep now. The girl thought about whether she would see Count Simond again. To some extent, she wanted to see him in prison, in this state, but on the other hand, she did not want to look at him anymore. An unexpected voice brought her out of her thoughts. He asked if he should show it to her. Kian, that boy, was leaning against the wall opposite the bed. First, he suddenly disappears, then just as unexpectedly appears right in her room. He extended his hand to her, and before thinking about it, she accepted it without realizing it. Suddenly it became dark. A moment later, she discerned the light of torches in the darkness. It almost glittered, dark, strong, the bars and stone walls of the prison. Being completely unsettled by such a sudden movement between the premises of the estate, she could not help but wonder who this boy was. They went downstairs, from where inaudible sounds were heard. He, holding the heroine by the hand, led her into the depths, taking care to be careful because it was dark there. Having descended, a picture appeared in front of them. In one of the cells, Count Salmon was sitting on his knees by the bars and desperately struggling with his voice. In contrast with his behavior earlier, it looked almost wild. Henriette stood in front of the cage, with a completely impenetrable expression on his face. The heroine quickly led them both behind the wall, nervous that it was too close, they might be noticed. This didn't make much of an impression on Kian, since everything is fine as long as she holds his hand, other people won't find out about them. The girl questioned this. Okay, ordinary people, but how will this affect the Duke? This took her back to the last chapter of the novel. Suddenly the Count's voice completely cracked, sounding almost like a scream. The aristocrats came to find him, Henriette began. He labeled Simond as a criminal who was preparing treason and the murder of the Duke. In response to this, the Count insisted more and more desperately that he and treason were completely incomparable concepts, so much so that it was simply nonsense. Henriette said that it was not for him to decide whether he had committed treason against the Emperor or not, and gritting his teeth, asked why Seaman needed to touch his daughter. If he couldn't raise her, then the baby, as he called her, should have been returned to him when he came to pick her up. It was stupid of him to believe the Count. The heroine stood there, watching in shock. It was incredibly touching to discover that the Duke came to pick her up, that is, he did not forget. It turned out that every time Henriette came repeatedly, the Count made excuses, when by the fact that the lady was now sick, when by some kind of trip where she went. The Duke himself believed his words, rather because he lacked the courage to meet his daughter. It was at the moment of a new wave of screams and accusations from the Count that the boy and heroine returned to the room, just as unexpectedly as they had left it. Kian explained this by saying that she started crying, which the girl didn't even notice, and it was better to end there. He said goodnight and disappeared, leaving a trail of red aura behind him. She lay back on the bed, but sleep still did not come. Her head was filled with thoughts about Kian's true identity. At the meeting, he asked not to tell anyone about him, but perhaps she should still ask Henrietta. Still, these fragmentary appearances and disappearances into obscurity gave her mixed feelings. A small hand knocked on the Duke's door. She, hugging a pillow as tall as she was, asked if they could sleep together tonight. The dim moonlight gave her eyes a special shine. Henriette replied that she couldn't sing lullabies, but the girl assured that everything was fine and she could handle it herself. They sat at a distance of less than an arm's length from each other. He held her hand comfortingly in his. He slept with a charming expression on his face, almost smiling. After the situation with the Count, the servants became overprotective. "That's all I heard around me, lady. Is the lady okay? Should I bring something for the lady? Isn't it cold, lady? Perhaps the lady would like some warm tea." With every new reason for these girls to worry, their methods of care became more and more sophisticated. It got to the point that more than 4 people wanted to help the little girl wash herself. Sitting in the warm water, the heroine noticed that the scars on her shoulders had almost healed. Faina explained that the reason for this effectiveness is a special magical medicine that the Duke received from the imperial physician, Miss Cecilia. She still could not come to her senses. From her indignation towards the Count and the way he behaved with such a small, precious, and incredibly pleasant lady. Her nostrils flared involuntarily every time she thought about it. Trying to distract herself, she quickly decided to stop hobbling around in such mud and began massaging the lady's shoulders, even before she gave her consent. The heroine was tickled by the movements of Faina's fingers until she laughed uncontrollably in her palm. Out of the corner of her ear, she heard that Count Saman would be punished, and records about his family would be completely destroyed. This is a much harsher punishment than the one the servants were muttering about. If everything turns out this way, then she will no longer have the opportunity to meet the Count. That is, she has no reason to be afraid anymore. A servant in purple entered the Duke's office, bowing. Henriette handed him the envelope with the letter, ordering him to deliver it personally. After asking if he had prepared what the gentleman asked, the man in purple stood with a massive stack of books. One of the maids reported that the heroine was called by the Duke, at this time, that is, right now. This put her in a stupor, since the girl had already told everything she knew about what was happening in the county, so she saw no reason to call her to talk. When she entered, she saw a huge number of books, entire piles stacked on the ground. The Duke invited her to sit on the soft sofa and rest a little. He said some strange name, and after a moment of assessment, he said something else. Then came the names Bert, Fioria, and others. A servant in purple stood to the side, also with a book in his hands, and agreed, leaving only impartial comments regarding certain names. The Empress who reigned 500 years ago, the nickname given to the ancient sage who took care of the crown of thorns. She understood without explanation that the Duke was choosing her name: Marie, Agelia, Galenia, Tepea. The sequels came one after another. At best, Henriette honored them with a drawn-out, thoughtful sound. It warmed her soul to see how he tried for her. Regina, Eos, Rania, Selina. It seemed to stretch on forever. Turning his head, he found the girl lying on the sofa, snoring peacefully. Henriette closed the book and picked her up, careful not to wake her. He carried her into the room, saying under his breath how quickly she gets tired. Something caught his attention, and turning his head outside the window, he saw the color pink. These roses evoked the spirit of his wife in his head. Her clothes themselves were replete with the image of these flowers. From hair color to smile. She called him by name. Placing the heroine on the bed, he carefully removed her hair from her forehead and sat down next to her, wishing her good night with a smile. In his hands rested the hair clips, which he carefully pulled out from her hair, letting them scatter across the pillow. The image of his wife, Lady Hungry, held out a flower to him, that same rose, looking softly at them both. She simply stated one name, Rosetta. The old name for summer roses, which are a symbol of the Hungarian family, is Rostista Charlotte. Rosetta Charlotte Hungary. This is how her name was chosen. The butler knocked on the door with his white-gloved knuckles. He gave the young man, whose doublet was decorated with gold fittings, an envelope with the family signet, a message from the Duchy of Hungary. After the situation with Count Simond, excessive concern from others began. An old lady in an impressive attire instructed that the girl had suffered many hardships at an early age, and now they, her servants, should surround her with even more love. Make sure that she lives with pleasure and does not regret anything. Although she believed that she had become more resilient after the prescribed treatment from the imperial doctor who came a few days ago, the servants tirelessly offered their help or accompaniment in all sorts of things. Even when Rosetta insisted that she would let them know if she needed anything, they still could not stop endlessly trying to help and interjecting themselves into seemingly offensive things. Still, the girl asked them for something. Play hide and seek together in the garden. The maids agreed without hesitation, in a chorus of one voice, looking so excited as if they were just waiting for the opportunity to please the lady. The girl stood with her back to them and counted intently. She could already easily count to 20 or 30, which clearly showed the positive influence of life on her native estate on her education. Girls in aprons, smiling from ear to ear, tried to mindlessly run away, holding their hems. Only now, right after 26, the count jumped to 100 under the disapproving cries of the maids. Although they did not reproach her at all, trying to quickly choose a good place and all the time teasing the girl, calling her to them, the Duke stood with his back straight as a string and looked menacingly at the estate workers. He asked Rosetta if she was saying that no one knew she had a fever. At the same time, the heroine lowered her head, avoiding any contact. It seemed as if a thundercloud, full of darkness and danger, was flying around Henrietta's head. The maids listened guiltily to his reprimand when he asked about their irresponsibility. How could they not notice the girl's condition? She kept pulling at the edge of his cloak, apologizing on her own, and trying to reduce the pressure she was exerting on her maids. He paid attention to her words and drew his own conclusion. His point was that the temperature in the duchy was a little cold for children. As soon as the heroine was overcome with relief, from the fact that the Duke decided to forget about the situation, streams of energy formed around him, which twisted into a disc opposite his hand. Henriette, with a completely serious look, said that the best solution would be to regulate the temperature in the entire duchy, which caused the servant in purple to almost tear out the hair on his head. With a dumbfounded face, he tried to convince the Duke that it was too troublesome, and to suddenly change the climate of the entire territory with magic. But Henriette did not pay any attention to this. Agreeing with the troublesomeness situation, he decided, send official letters to each district as a solution. Desperate arguments rained down one after another. There were problems with the work process, the training of the workforce, which the Duke wanted to optimize simply by allocating the appropriate budget, and the inevitable problems with the ecosystem. Despite Rosette's attempts to reassure her father that she was fine, he was still of the opinion that the dukedom should be a place where she could walk around in peace. And anyway, he planned to do it. It's okay if they start earlier. The impassivity of the master and the servant in purple was mind-boggling. His face became more and more desperate with every word, and his gestures became more and more intense. Faina, in a whisper, suggested that the heroine try now what they had talked about earlier. She stuttered, out of unfamiliarity, calling Henrietta Dad, trying to attract his attention, amid arguments and an intense flow of magic. She grabbed him by the hem of his cloak and suggested that he mark the temperature only in the estate, because she only plays in the garden. This, however, calmed the Duke, as evidenced by the dissipation of magic. He agreed to do so, but if she wanted to go beyond the limits, she should let him know in advance. There was a pause between them, which Rosetta broke by calling him Daddy again. This brought a smile to Henrietta's face, which excited the servants, and addressed her directly as his daughter. She laughed, a childish, happy laugh. She only had a slight fever, which moreover subsided in the morning. This, however, bothered the maids, so she stayed to play inside the manor that afternoon, despite the fact that they brought her huge sets of sewing equipment, books, drawing pads, and in general the whole range of things that might interest a lady. Constantly staying inside these walls quickly gets boring. Rosetta decided to bring some books from the office. Walking along the corridor, she noticed something below. Previously, she had not seen flowers here. Perhaps this is due to the snow, because now it has melted. Her gaze suddenly darted to the crimson butterfly, which was right next to her face. The railings were almost as tall as her, so when the butterfly flew into the distance, the heroine had to climb over them, and subsequently she could not maintain her balance. As she fell, her bottom caught the breath, with long black hair flowing around it like a curtain. She closed the gold and folded her hands in a gesture similar to a prayer. There were either petals flying around, or some particles of deep red magic. The next moment she found herself in the middle of green trees, Kian holding her by the shoulders in a calming gesture. The heroine tried to compare the thoughts in her head regarding this boy. It was just bigger. And then, although it was nonsense, she asked Kinu if he was that crimson butterfly. Rosette remembered her conversation with the Duke about him. Henriette stood firm that she did not know of a boy who fit this description and lived on the estate. He even came up in earnest, asking where she met him and what he did to her. From the fact that Henriette knows nothing about Kiana, and the boy even uses abilities that allow him to hide from the Duke, the conclusion follows that he is not a person. She expressed her suspicions to the boy, to which he reacted nonchalantly and admitted that he was a fairy. He asked if the heroine had heard stories that fairies lived in the Albendel forest in the Duchy of Hungary. Only now, the fairies that the heroine knew didn't look like that. The explanation for this was simple. There are a huge number of different types of fairies. For example, headless knight, shoemaker, cat walking on two legs. He was one of these types of fairies, assuring her that he was not her enemy and did not pose a danger. These words sounded especially convincing, and besides, he had helped the girl more than once. Based on this, she decided that it could be believed. He explained his appearance in the form of a butterfly by the fact that he thought Rosetta was bored. Kian extended his hand to her, inviting her, in that case, to play with him. She accepted the hand only on the condition that they play inside. The crew moved along the road to the Duke's estate. A guy in a neat suit, looking at the walls and spires of a familiar building, noticed some changes. The second guy, who could easily be confused with the Duke of Hungarian, answered cynically, almost disrespectfully, clenching his teeth to the point of grinding. The difference from the time when they were subsequently here was the absence of snow on the roof. They doubted whether this was really an order from their father. Kian took him and the girl to a glass greenhouse. He offered to show her everything here, since the last time she fell into the lake, she didn't take a good look at everything. Of course, she was only allowed to enter here with servants, but the boy easily replied that he would show her places that she could not go even with servants. After moments of exciting reflection, after all, the stories about the stigmas sealed in the lake made their impression. She accepted his hand. He intertwined his fingers with hers and said so confidently that it didn't even occur to him to question it, that everyone living here was uncontrollably afraid of him, so nothing threatened the girl. They wandered along the paved paths with measured steps. The eye was sweetened by truly incredible displays of decorative craftsmanship, including statues, endless columns with a complex interweaving of arches, and all this decorated with different flowers, variegated colors. The further they walked, the more beautiful it became. But there was also a catch to it, in the form of strange amorphous creatures, strange shapes. This made Rosette cower behind Kian's shoulder, even as the creatures moved away as they approached. She voiced her impressions of their strangeness. The boy explained that these entities are one of the types of stigmata. Usually stigmata are born like this, but there are also cases when they become stigmata after death. Having completed the formation process, they become a separate subspecies of their breed. This information prompted the heroine to ask the question, why do such creatures live in a glass greenhouse? As if reading her thoughts, Kian took her hand, leading her deeper and continuing his stories. Initially, the Duchy of Hungary was a barren, lifeless territory. Cold land where nothing could grow or live. That was what this place was like. Hungary's ancestor, like the current duke, received protection from the powerful guardian star. The imperial family highly valued the previous duke and tried to maintain friendly relations with him, but he was too ambitious. As a result, the imperial family declared war on the Hungarian family. Having won, they expelled the latter to a very separate place, to the lifeless north, infested with a huge number of stigmata. The imperial family waited for them to start begging them for help. But the Hungarians were able to independently subjugate this northern land, thereby becoming the only powerful wall protecting the empire from stigmata. This factor significantly affected the crown. If the Hungarian family goes ahead and manages to tame the stigmata, it will be a reminder to the empire that they are not safe. As far as the heroine remembered, stigmata appear in the second part of the novel. It was about those who are sealed here. She made Henrietta the only villain, But still, now she wants to stay on his side, perhaps due to the fact that she herself is part of the Hungarian family. Kian thinks it's so stupid, but interesting at the same time, that the people who were sent to feed on the stigmata ended up using the stigmata to keep people like them at bay. He thought people would be more careful, because not much time had passed since the incident in Altba. The Altba Empire is a large state that called itself an empire, but due to the invasion of the stigmata, along with their king, it was destroyed in one night. This was 9 years ago. The Jurt Empire and the surrounding lands remained in chaos for a long time. Not much time has passed since this disaster, but it has already been recorded in history. Kian actually spoke as if he were not a person. All she heard was that the imperial family got what they deserved. It seemed Henriette had taken proper revenge on her. This is where the conversation ended. They walked in silence to the end of the greenhouse. The silence was interrupted only by the shaking of the heroine's head around, trying to notice every detail, and the sounds of water from somewhere in the depths of the greenery. Having crossed a bridge over an artificially made stream, the boy said that that was all, and if she was satisfied, it was better to return, because they had already begun to look for her. He knows this for sure. Fairies have good hearing. Suddenly, a black hand crawled up imperceptibly and grabbed her ankle. This almost scared Rosetta to death, but Kian, with the look of a thundercloud, stepped on this hand, pressing it with his heel and saying what a nonsense it was. The next moment, he turned to the girl with a sweet face, asking if everything was okay with her. He called her by name, but the heroine is sure that she did not call it to him. The boy quickly said that he simply heard the servants call her that and asked if she could make it. He carried them into the corridors of the estate. Before leaving, with a smile on his face, he reproached her for impoliteness, since she did not introduce herself, and, in the same tone, asked her to personally say her name. From the moment she was given a name, she was not officially called that by anyone. Now it made her teaching heartbeat. Having gathered her strength, she placed her hand on her chest, smiling brightly, and announced that she was Rosetta Charlotte Hungary. The boy was satisfied. He asked if they were friends now that they were closer, having learned the name, which seemed to the heroine a strange way of values in fairies. But she saw nothing wrong with being friends with him. She agreed, hoping that their friendship would also mean they could communicate informally. Somewhere behind, the voice of a maid was heard, confidently approaching. Kian disappeared, finally promising to have fun some other time. Faina ran out onto the balcony, clearly relieved that she had found the lady, and said the young gentleman had arrived. Duke's eldest and second blew. Rosetta entered the Duke's office with silence like a heartbeat. Her mouth was involuntarily slightly open, and the pupils in her eyes were dilated. In the office, in front of the table where the Duke was sitting, there were 2 guys with a significant difference in height. They turned to her as soon as they heard the sound of the door. They looked much older than in the portraits. The girl was overcome by doubts whether they would remember her and whether they could get along. She immediately regretted that she had assigned them certain characters relative to her own ideas about villains. The eldest was very similar to Henrietta. It was clear even in his gaze. He knelt down to be level with her. Suddenly he noticed out loud how small she was and how big her eyes were. This caused misunderstanding on her part, but he took any word she said as a sign that she was not a doll. The next moment, Avel took her hand and smiled sweetly, saying that he was her older brother. He missed her very much and how good it was that she returned. Her other brother leaned down with interest, and then without warning, he grabbed her by the waist and lifted her into the air, twirling and exclaiming with delight, "This is his little sister." Soon, Rosetta even laughed. It was like an attraction. He called himself Camille, still twirling her, saying to his brother how sweet she was, much sweeter than all those sisters they boasted about at the academy. Avel reproached him for the noise. They were still in front of his father. Camille pulled Rosette to her feet. The Duke approached Zadu, introducing his sons to her once again. The eldest and second, Calix, the youngest, will return later. Then they will get to know each other. The heroine clasped her hands, and with a sweet smile that only children are capable of, said that she was glad to meet you and asked him to take care of her. This caused a surge of tenderness in Henrietta. Abel, in turn, remained with the same impenetrable face and appearance, and only Camille's eyes showed his characteristic interest. Henriette appealed to his sons, since they have no business in the imperial palace, let them live here on the estate. This was quite sudden for the heroine. From the point of view of the author of the novel, she understood that they should have appeared later and the characters were inappropriate. It was almost an invitation, but the Duke briefly said that it was an order. The sons lowered their heads and even took the same poses in their submissive silence. The atmosphere of interactions between them seemed frightening. Camille asked if they could take Rosette for a walk. Still, this is their first meeting, and he personally wanted to spend as much time as possible with her. Henriette's words felt like blades being brought to her throat. His son had always been considerate, the Duke only giving his permission on the condition that they were confident that they could take care of her and would not be reckless in being extremely careful. At the door she said goodbye to him, calling him Dad and saying that they would return soon. He smiled in response. This was already something incredible for his sons, and then answered simply, "He will wait." Either one or the other completely blew off the heads of the sons. They walked in the courtyard of the estate. Camille did not stop expressing his emotions regarding how green it was here. When he arrived once, everything was covered with snow. Rosetta explained that Henriette wanted to melt the snow throughout the entire duchy, but through the efforts and persuasion skills of her assistant, this idea was postponed for later. It seemed to him that his father had gone crazy. The catch was that even having mastered such magic perfectly, the climate can only be regulated within a narrow range, not to mention the huge number of side problems with this. Camille was very sociable, but Avel, on the contrary, when it came to talking about Henrietta, he became aloof, not paying any attention to such conversations. Apparently, he actually despises their father. The relationship between the brothers looked quite warm, which made her happy. The second son, to lighten the mood, suggested that she come up with a cute nickname. Everyone at his academy does this. The stars seemed to shine around him. Along with this joyful enthusiasm, even Avel smiled in agreement. The first option was Rosie, then Rose and Zizi. But with the latter, it was difficult to understand whose nickname it was, so they decided to go with Rosie. Despite the childish nature of this thing, she appreciated how they approached it with soul. When the two of them were worried that she didn't like it, she decided to come up with nicknames for them as well. She named the eldest Ava and the second Millie. This discouraged the brothers a little, but they quickly pulled themselves together, watching how she rejoiced at her invention. Seeing her pure happiness, they undoubtedly squeezed out smiles as well, although they came out rather forced. Abel leaned over, stroking her head, and explained himself as gently as possible. She can call him whatever she wants. He likes everything, but in front of others it is strictly prohibited, as they may begin to despise them. They are a family that is considered evil throughout the empire. There are many people who are looking for opportunities to attack them. You cannot expose what is happening inside the family. This will give them another reason to mock them. After these words, she clearly understood the strange atmosphere between the Duke and his children. It seems that Henriette raised his sons so as not to be despised, that is, indifferently and strictly, and it looks like he succeeded, as befits a true villain. After this story, Abel immediately apologized, saying that he said too much, and if he suddenly brought up bad memories in her, then he is incredibly sorry. In her novel, the eldest son was most like his father, although he despised him, a merciless monster that stands on par with Genier. But now he was very different from the version that the heroine created. Now he is sophisticated and affectionate. She quickly reassured him, because the Count had already received a worthy punishment, so there was nothing to worry about. Walking further and holding on to his arms, Camille reasoned that, in his opinion, Simon died too easily. At dawn, he was supposed to be killed by a black monster, but he went crazy and committed suicide. He continued to describe with relish in detail the more passing methods that were characteristic of the villainous reputation. Many of them, and all of them, were painfully cruel, so much so that they even hurt the ears, for which Abel reproached him. The psyche of a child is a fragile thing. He asked if everything was okay with her. Perhaps he understood this better because he was the eldest. Then a glass greenhouse flashed in the light nearby. They noticed the girl's interest, and she used this as an opportunity to ask if they knew Kiana. She described it in general terms, since the name gave no results. After thinking a little, Camille was the first to guess, but she believed that children often have imaginary friends. He tried to whisper this in his brother's ear, but she heard it perfectly. After that, Any attempts to prove the opposite did not bear any fruit, and besides, the two of them had not been in the estate for a long time. They have no way of knowing. Interpreting her facial expression as a decline in mood, they began to console her under the pretext that they simply wanted to find out more about Rosetta's good friend. She described Kian as handsome, caring, and polite, but sometimes he is a bit of a bother. A picture appeared before her of how he was leading her into a kind of dance. This was how communication was. He always showed her incredible things that she would hardly have touched without him. Avel labeled him a bad friend if he allowed himself to harm her. He asked from now on if someone offends her to immediately tell him. With a too calm and serious face, he concluded that he would drown any offender in the lake. It occurred to her that now, if someone wants to teach her, she should warn him to be careful. Millie, with the same casual air, noticed that this was a little different, because his father would get angry if the water in his meal spoiled. He enthusiastically invited his brother to cut off his head and bury it in the garden as fertilizer. It would be much more useful. The heroine belatedly confirmed her guesses. One should not expect sound ideas in this house. At sunset, they returned inside for a family meal. She passed in complete silence, interrupted only by short, cold instructions from Henrietta. Whenever any of his sons glanced somewhere in the room, he drew attention to the fact that they should concentrate on eating. After that, they certainly looked down at the plates. Rosetta felt this tense atmosphere especially keenly. Before that, she was alone with the Duke, so she didn't particularly remember the others. There were some differences from the version she knew. At least the relationship was much colder. Today she was tired, so she fell asleep first as soon as her head touched the pillow. At night, she woke up with a feeling of dry mouth. Taking the cup, she noticed that the lights were on everywhere. She was drinking thoughtfully when suddenly the fabric of someone's dress flashed in the doorway, from the surprise of which the girl almost dropped the cup. She came closer to ask if anyone was there. Slipping behind the glare of that semi-transparent fabric, she froze in the doorway. In front of her face stood a majestic figure, incredibly beautiful, illuminated by moonlight. Her clothes were white, and obviously not of a modern cut, and her face was covered with a veil that cascaded down to the floor. Her voice was also mystical, otherworldly, which betrayed the nature of a ghost. She apologized for frightening the girl for the tactlessness of her request, if everything was fine with her to follow the lady in white. She reinforced this with a vague phrase that they had prepared a place especially for her. Of course, Rosetta was at least a little scared at the prospect of following a ghost on such a dark night, but they always helped the girl, and it was obvious that the lady had something to do with her. Now it was late, but abnormally light. Only when passing near the huge stained glass window did she realize that it was not because of the torches, but the full moon was to blame. The lady flew in front with a lamp in her hands, adding ambience to everything. The full moon is a symbol of magic. The heroine heard that the full moon fills everything with magic. Today, for the first time in a long time, the moon is in this position. Thanks to this, many ghosts can gain power without the permission of the master to show their appearance. Already in front of the doors, which poured in more and more light as they opened, the lady ended with the phrase that they had been waiting for such an opportunity for a long time to greet the girl. Behind the doors was a hall full of food, gold, and a festive atmosphere. There was even a piano. The ghosts of maids and other workers crowded around all this. The lady bowed at the example from, and said that she must be late with the introductions. They, those who live in this estate, and receive from the master a chance for life in a new form, and they regret that they did not have the opportunity to greet it properly earlier. And the lady's name was Annabel. She was the figure in charge of all these ghosts. The ghosts began to say their names and responsibilities one by one. Olga Benson is responsible for the security and supervision of the estate. Volbet Ayal was responsible for protecting the castle from curses. Cindella Evelden, under whose command there was magic in the estate. All of them had voices to some extent familiar to the heroine, but she could not remember where she had met them before. Someone stopped her as she ran up the stairs. Someone remembers her from that incident in the workshop, and so on ad infinitum. The lady in white busily interrupted this flow, again starting her speech that they had gathered today to introduce themselves to Rosetta. Although so late, for which they were embarrassed, she expressed her hopes, common to all the servants of the estate, that the girl would be quite comfortable here. Her speech was very enticing, alluring, one could listen to it for hours, and moreover, it was not lacking in secular character. To these sounds, which warmed their ears in themselves, some servants began to play instruments. Their performance amazed the heroine. Such clarity in observing the notes raised a rhetorical question about their ghostly nature. The chefs brought her dessert after seating her at a table in the very center of the celebration. Many people danced around the hall in pairs, all of which amused Rosetta. She and the ladies sat there and enjoyed a delicious dessert. The second one was mostly fed by the girls' positive emotions about the welcoming event. Suddenly, Annabel asked if she could ask the heroine a question. At the root of the issue was the proximity of that dangerous creature, as she described it, to Rosetta. With a bit of misunderstanding, she remembered how the ghost tried to dissuade her from running in the direction in which, as it turned out, Kian was. Hearing his name so carelessly called to her, it was as if they were cut by lightning. The hall was completely absorbed in silence. Signs of horror were barely audible. The same thing was clearly heard in Annabel's voice, which trembled. The veil around was shaking violently in all directions. The only adjectives she used to describe Kian were entirely negative, something like a cruel monster in danger. The lady also emphasized the threat when she heard that Rosetta considered him her friend. She even grabbed the girl by the hand, unfortunately, without being able to give enough details. But one thing was clearly stated: it was better not to approach him further. The whispers continued in the hall, although the general shock and paralysis subsided. Annabel began her blurry story with the phrase that they all once lost to him. Therefore, there are restrictions on the contract. These are the rules of those who have died and are connected to this world by magic. He had imposed too many restrictions for them to now mention him to the girl. But the lady could only tell her one thing: remember his eyes. Rosette is the one who can hear their voices even when it is not allowed, so she has no problem seeing his eyes. The whole stream of information that was dumped on her was a burden and tangled into a ball, but that was the only thing the lady could say. The event was interrupted by an open door, from which Henriette appeared, who fiercely asked what they were doing here at such a time. What were they thinking, waking up his daughter so early? The ghosts began vying with each other to apologize. Rosetta, knowing where this was going, ran up to her father and explained herself that they just wanted to greet her. The Duke took her in his arms and began to talk about the proper care of the child, which was pleased with the ironic spectacle. In fact, all this was thanks to the consultations of Milady Ennis. They have already borne fruit. That woman, exquisitely dressed, with a hat and rose decorations, gave excellent lessons for parents on raising children. Henriette decided to return her to the room immediately. The girl finally agreed, noticing that Annabel had disappeared somewhere, and she was among the ghosts who bowed their heads, given her recognizable outfit. He put his daughter to bed and promised strawberry cake for floppy disk tomorrow morning. The Duke asked if the ghosts hadn't called her just to say a bunch of useless things. Rosetta denied this joyfully. She enthusiastically talked about how they ate delicious food together, listened to the mystical game of ghosts, and talked about Kiana, the fairy she met on the estate, she explained to her father. He was dismayed by this information, because as far as he knew, that is, impeccably, there were no fairies in the castle. This made the heroine think about her first attempt to talk about this boy. Henriette brushed a strand of hair from her face as a gesture of comfort. He said that now there are only 2 boys on the estate, Avel and Camelon, in a tone that suppresses any doubts, and explained to Cain how it was just her dream. Still, there is another boy here, but she couldn't possibly cross paths with him because he doesn't leave the room. But Cain is probably someone else, since the Duke would have recognized him from her description otherwise. He patted her head goodbye. Due to the fact that he still had work to do, it was not possible to take Rosetta to his room, but they would see each other in the morning. After some hesitation, she pulled his sleeve and pressed her lips to his cheek. Henrietta's pupils dilated so much that they seemed to cover the entire iris. The girl herself hid behind a blanket to hide her face, which had turned purple. The Duke suddenly smiled, thanking his daughter for the concern she showed in asking him to finish quickly and go to bed. He told her to also rest well. The 3rd Min Calyx would arrive tomorrow, and they would have the opportunity to get acquainted. Rosetta crawled into the blanket with her head, diligently assuring herself that she was only 7, and there was nothing awkward in her action. She wondered why the Duke's relationship with the others turned out this way. Although he also behaved with her at first, his parental love was still obvious. The last thought that arose in her head before she finally fell asleep was about Calyx. In the novel she wrote, He was crazy, but with so much already deviating from the canon of her manuscript, she could only hope that they could get along. During breakfast, Rosetta recounted to her brothers the events of the previous night. They listened to all this with interest, and even made the girl promise to share dessert, which she spoke about with no less enthusiasm. As soon as the Duke's arrival was announced and he entered, taking his place at the head of the table, a bottomless silence fell. No one said a word while they ate. Henriette behaved the same way, adding fuel to the gloomy atmosphere. When they had all finished the main meal, dessert was served to the table. The heroine drew attention to the thin and neat shape of the treat, despite the fact that the glaze spread, obviously not according to the cook's intention, and the strawberries did not maintain the position in which they were supposed to be. The brothers, seeing her look, asked if it was the first time she had seen such a form, but she, in turn, turned to Henrietta praising him, because this time his cooking came out much better than the last. The Duke was pleased with his daughter's sincere happiness. He just nodded his head with a smile and confirmed that today's treat was prepared by him. In turn, the sons froze, unable to understand whether they heard it or not. Their father— what did he do? Have you prepared a cake? He calmly explained that food could be poisoned, and as a result of his experience in the county, Rosette was uncomfortable when she ate, so he began to cook on his own, mastering the skill step by step, starting with those cookies. Avel and Camillon were still looking at each other blankly, trying to comprehend the information that had just been dumped on them despite the years of their upbringing. She savored the cake and believed that it would help the family become closer. It was, after all, food from her father. The voice announced the arrival of the young master Calix, which Rosetta was animated by. A boy came in, most resembling his sister in appearance. He greeted from the threshold father and brothers, but when his gaze slid to the heroine, he asked out loud who it was, calling her a pea. Camillon stood up for his sister, reproaching Calix for the fact that it was not necessary to speak like that about the diminutiveness of her physique, and besides, these were literally the consequences of a traumatic experience. With the same mixture of disdain and skepticism, he asked if this was the fourth child he had heard about, whether the Duke was sufficiently convinced of the authenticity of her blood connection with their family. Perhaps she is a fake, with which others have targeted them. Henriette, not wanting to listen any longer to this absurdity, which should have sounded like a reasonable remark, but in the eyes of her father was just boasting, sent Calix to his room and forbade him to leave without his permission to fix it. Avel and Camillon immediately rushed to take care of Rosie's well-being after this scene, promising to scold him later, but the girl tried to convince them that there was no need for this, because she was ready for this, and her brother would begin to hate her even more if show anger. For a moment they froze with a synchronized exhalation of her name. The next second, Kami wrapped his arms around her, discussing with his older brother how they could kill the Count again, and much more sophisticatedly. This caused the heroine to smile awkwardly. They thought that the reason why she doesn't like it when people get angry lies in the fact that there is arbitrariness in the Count's house. Of course, it wasn't a completely accurate guess, but she didn't mind. In the evening, while drawing, she twirled the milk toast between her fingers and thought about Kalinka's words. Her mind became childish, as was her body, so she quickly got used to the fact that everyone around her loved her. But the fact is that the whole situation in which she found herself was strange. In the original novel, there was no such character as Rosetta. She had no connections between the main character and the heroine. The seat of Villains of Hungary consisted only of the Duke and his 3 sons. There was also an assistant Henrietta, family servants, and Count Salmond, but the plot did not provide for such a person as she became. The plot structure she wrote is more future-like, when Count Salmond appeared. Of course, at this time there was no betrayal, and Abel, Camillon, and Calix should not have been in the estate at all. Rosetta wonders if everything has changed because of her. To begin with, it seems that the case of Count Salmond is closely connected with her, but all this, in the end, turned out to be beneficial for her. Perhaps this is due to her as the author of this novel. Kian was still considered the strangest in her circle. She cannot understand the nature of his abilities, but compared to the others, it is a fact that he is not an ordinary person. But such a character did not appear in the original plot either. These thoughts made her head smoke and her temperature rise. Therefore, she decided to perceive Kian, as the brothers said, as her imaginary friend. She told the servants that she wanted to be alone and would call them later based on my needs. But suddenly, there were sounds outside the door. It was Ava. His visit was sudden, but the reason for this was the need to return to the capital soon. Due to his position as an imperial knight, he wanted to spend the time that he still had at home with her. Avel sat down with a book near her bed, while the heroine, hugging a pillow, listened to his colorful story about the princess who defeated the monster under the bed and saved the frightened prince. His narrative was so realistic that the heroine involuntarily remembered how identical this genre was to the variation that was in her past life. Seeing that she had become quiet, Avel immediately told her not to be afraid of monsters, because she had a brother. He paused, considering the kindest words to describe his plans to fight the monsters. This included cutting the throat, burying it in the ground, and then embroidering any flowers on this soil. Her eyes widened with the realization that this was a soft version of his thoughts. The monster and the stigmata are technically different creatures. She asked her brother why monsters love to hide in the comfort of beds. The most likely answer is that they are simply not baptized. In this world, everyone is baptized from birth. Sunlight, air, earth, and every object in this world, starting with the guardian star. All this so that creatures can breathe, live, and exist even in the dark. This raises the question of what happens to the unbaptized, but the truth is that everyone is baptized. If anyone can be called such, it is either someone who is stronger than this, or someone who cannot be called a living being. While narrating, he suddenly waved his hands in order to scare. It was a joke, but the heroine buried her face in the pillow, being really scared. She promised that she would show him her frightened appearance only once. Avel, in turn, patted her on the head, telling her that he was really very glad to have her back, and actually missed her. He wanted to continue reading books to her when such opportunities arose. Already before going to bed, the main theme in my head was that she had become completely naive according to deists. Everyone around her accepted this, perhaps as compensation for the lack of love in her childhood, but with everyone trying so hard to treat her well, she decided that she should also make an effort to fit in. She was abruptly pulled out of her shallow sleep by a frightening sound from under the bed. She sat on the bed in a panic, trying to analyze the situation. Something really moved. But Avel was sitting right there earlier. If there was something there, he would have noticed. Rosetta decided that there was definitely nothing there. She just needed to make sure of it by looking under the bed in order to calm the growing anxiety. She gathered her strength and hung over the edge of the bed, looking into the darkness in one breath. From there, a pair of red eyes stared back at her. Without wasting time, she screamed, and at these sounds her father and brothers came running, who immediately picked her up in his arms. Out of fright, she could barely say a word clearly. The Duke said to search the entire room, including her bed. As a result of a detailed check, there was nothing there. She was asked what happened, whether there was someone in the bed. With tears in her eyes, she could barely describe the monster with red eyes. Avel recognized his share of guilt in this, because it was he who read her a fairy tale about such a monster, having won his father's displeasure. Rosette tried to resolve this by assuring her that she really enjoyed it when her brother read for her. In addition, she is not at all scared, now that everyone, Henriette, Avel, Millie, has come, even including her youngest brother, as she called him, causing Calix's displeasure, although he himself recently, without even having time to say hello, called her a pea. Avel continued to apologize for this from different sides, which made the Duke look even more like a thundercloud. The heroine, realizing that this leads to even greater distance in the family, leaned over and kissed her brother on the forehead, thanking him. Then she turned to Henrietta, insisting that the appearance of the monster was not Avel's fault at all, and if he was angry for it, she would stop kissing him. And it worked quite well. They agreed that he should choose his book more carefully next time. The elder brother was still standing there, discouraged, while Millie next to him also wanted to receive a kiss. Calix, having watched, rolled his eyes a little and left there, while the others vied with each other to offer Rosetta to sleep together for her peace of mind. Among them, she decided that Henrietta was the safest, since she could still confidently say that she had not dreamed of that creature, although everyone considered it nothing more than a dream. The next day, she kept thinking about that red-eyed look. Unable to bear it, she slammed the book and told the servant that she had gone for a walk and went in search of Kian, guided by her guesses. She quickly moved along the glass greenhouse calling the boy. He did not appear, and she pressed that if he did not appear, she would go herself to that lake, full of strange hands and danger. After that, Kian suddenly appeared behind her, and the first thing he did was ask her if everything was okay, taking her hand. He was surprised that she herself came to look for him this time for some reason, which, as she explained, lay in whether he had been under her bed yesterday. For a moment this unsettled him, but then he grinned, as if she understood it only now. He was pleased, sincerely glad that she, although belatedly, still recognized him. He did something similar, asked because he was angry. She, after all, called him only her imaginary friend. This completely unsettled Rosetta. She mentioned this only mentally, in conversations with herself. So obvious anxieties followed. How could he know this? Meanwhile, he continued to insist that isn't it something out of bounds to refer to a living being as if it were fictitious? For effect, he carefully grabbed her face and said that he was standing right in front of her. The feeling was strange. His hands were quite cold. Behind him, she saw those frightening eyes again for a moment as he apologized, saying he didn't want to make her cry. Rosette removed his hand from her face, accepting the apology, but she demanded that he explain who he really was, reinforcing this with the fact that she could not call someone she did not know a friend. Suddenly, there was a cry from Calix, which was addressed to Kian. The question was about who let him into the glass greenhouse. The conversation was strange. The father was mentioned there, as if they had known each other for a long time. Calix straightened his back, still standing his ground. He reminded Kian that he told him to know his place and act appropriately, finally calling the boy Crown Prince. Rosetta looked in bewilderment, first at one and then at the other. Calix confirmed who else could be the Crown Prince besides the one standing in front of her. Despite the heroine's reaction, Kian smiled and asked if she now knows who he is. Can they continue to be friends? Her indignation at the fact that he called himself a fairy also amused him. The boy especially liked qualities such as naivety and charm in her. He told her this with a completely serious face. Calix interrupted their sweet interaction, demanding the Crown Prince to leave the greenhouse. Since he couldn't get away with it, Kian offered to take the heroine to the estate. All this seemed very strange to her. If you think about all the incidents in which they met with him, it was obvious that he kept silent about many things, or decided not to go into explanations. He responded with a literal, "I don't know," without bringing up the details of how the cruel Duke of Hungary had taken the Crown Prince hostage under the pretext of teaching him magic as one way to undermine the imperial power by holding them as puppets. The boy still smiled sweetly, holding this topic as something not worthy of interest. His answer to the question that all this time what he was doing was magic was a statement of fact, because Rosetta herself must know that her father is an outstanding man. One of the dissonances with trying to put together a full picture of what was happening was her attempts to find out something about him, which brought no results, because she could not find people who knew him. For Kian, this was a self-evident thing, since only she knows his real name. He asked her, no matter what happens, to think about the good, saying that if she could be afraid of him at least a little less, he would be happy. It still seemed incredibly confusing for the heroine. So this means that Kian is human. Then all the amazing things that she had to see, his magic. It would be difficult for him to imitate the Crown Prince. But then, what do the warnings from the ghosts mean? They encountered the heroine's brothers near the entrance to the estate. They were surprised by the fact that the imaginary friend Rosetta was talking about turned out to be the Crown Prince. Millie immediately wrapped his arms around her and thanked the boy. But then they were on their own. If they think about it, it was Kian who told her about the relationship between the Hungarian family and the imperial one. The second is now supported by the Duke, and the current emperor and prince act as puppets to protect the Hungarian family. But in that case, Kian must have hatred for this family. Next, Henriette joined the whole group. When he saw the Crown Prince, he politely bowed his head and asked how his day was going. The boy was no less polite, answering that he was calm, thanks to the Duke. Henriette caught Rosetta's gaze at this entire scene and notified Kian that it was time for him to return. Tomorrow, Avel is also heading to the Imperial Palace, so he will accompany him. Kian expressed his regret about this, since it was with such difficulty that he became the girl's friend, which caused a pause in the conversation, drawing all attention to their exchange of glances. The conversation will continue with the fact that Avel should also prepare for tomorrow's return in advance. And for Camelon in turn, the Duke invited a tutor and classes will begin tomorrow. It was time for him and Rosetta to have a regular snack and tea. Of course it was a good idea, But leaving the brothers with Kian like this doesn't seem like a particularly good idea. She suggested that everyone eat together. Everyone was sitting behind a pillar in the middle of the terrace, under the open sky. But this did not make the atmosphere any more bearable. Just like last time, there was silence. Calix was unhappy from the moment the heroine called him. There was nothing to add about the relationship between the brothers and father, and only Kian looked relaxed as a spectator. She wanted to somehow correct this state of affairs. With all her determination, she took the cake to the maid, which she carried to the table and cut it herself. With a happy smile, she brought everyone a piece, calling everyone by affectionate nicknames. Next up was Kiana, but she still hesitated, addressing him with his full title, and when she gave it to her little brother, she encountered his disapproval, which bordered on contempt. Since he didn't want to take the plate himself, Rosetta offered to feed him with a fork. On the other side of the table, Camelin expressed his approval of the idea that she should feed him too. Henriette told her not to walk so much and to sit down to eat. The atmosphere became noticeably warmer. Avel asked if the chair was too high for her, and then wiped the crumbs left on his lips. She started a dialogue about the quality of food in the imperial palace. Thus, at least some kind of dialogue was formed in this family, which could not but rejoice. She calmly began to eat her portion, harboring hopes that this would continue. After the meal, Kian asked her if she was now sure that he was not imaginary. Rosetta answered with a thoughtful look, saying that he still seems to her like a fairy more than an ordinary person. It was hard to tell if there was something special about him that made him so different from other people. There are tens of thousands of mysteries in the world related to the guardian stars, but there are a huge number of methods of protection, so it is difficult to understand what Kian's power is. She remembered the words of Annabelle, who asked her to remember his eyes well. She questioned the boy about this, comparing the red glow in his iris to expensive, indescribable jewelry. This unsettled Kian, who was usually carefree. He froze and asked if it was true that his eyes really looked like that. His depressed look made the heroine realize that, without realizing it, she had made a mistake by saying something wrong. She awkwardly tried to correct herself with stuttering, focusing on the beauty and sparkle of his eyes. He clung to this thread, accepting it as a possibility that she simply didn't see well, nothing more. After thinking a little, he realized that he never had time to say thank you to her for becoming his friend. He extended his hand to her and leaned closer, suggesting that they continue to be friends. The imperial castle seemed to stretch towards the horizon. It was made in warm colors, dominated by gold, which only visually enlarged the structure. On its territory, along with flower beds and a long road to the entrance through the terraces, a provincial village could be located. Her novel had no title and was scribbled casually on a notepad. She could not even dream of publishing such a text on the internet, and the only readers were her friends. As time passed, things became confusing, and the novel was never completed. But even so, everything was thought out in her head, down to the details, and, as she remembers, the content amazingly came into her head. In any case, the prince is not an important person in this context. Not only his name, but also his image, as well as life and death. Everything remained uncertain behind the scenes. The focus was on the empire, and the story was meant to be about a protagonist from the aristocracy, so his character is similar to him. She came to the imperial palace for the first time. Kian smiled and asked about her impressions. Rosetta briefly commented on how huge and beautiful it was, unable to come up with a proper description of all this skillful work of the architects. How did it happen that she ended up in this place? Earlier, the boy asked if the heroine would like to go with him to the palace, arguing this proposal to her family by saying that he finally had such a friend, so he would like to introduce her to His Majesty. Since not only Avel is leaving, but the Duke himself will go there, this is a good opportunity for Rosetta to visit the imperial castle for the first time. And hesitantly, seeking her father's permission and her brother's opinions on this, she finally agreed. Camelin, with a completely unimpressed expression on his face, said that there is also an indefinite such in the duchy. Calix supported, saying, of course, nothing new. They even took the same poses, with the most condescending faces. Avel, as soon as he arrived at the palace, immediately returned to the knightly order. And the rest of the family went inside the building. Moreover, the crown prince himself gives them a tour, right up to the audience hall. A huge hall opened up before them inside, illuminated by countless windows. It looked more like a cathedral than anything else. It was jam-packed with people of different levels of the aristocracy in expensive clothes. On a pedestal that towered over the entire hall and was framed by huge bowls of fire, the emperor sat. His hair was long and blonde. He smiled slightly, which clearly outlined his wrinkles, and his gaze was soft. Hungarian family bowed behind the duke, as required by basic etiquette, greeting His Majesty the Emperor, the shining pride of the Gelt Empire. Georgia also made a simple curtsy, being incredibly glad that they had not taught such simple rules. The emperor condescendingly noted out loud such formalities that were completely uncharacteristic of their relationship. He has a conversation with Henrietta, so he ordered the others to leave immediately, Kian whispered to her, so as not to happen now, not to show too obvious surprise, clearly amused by what followed, while people, one after another, obediently slid out the doors in a stream. As soon as the last aristocrat left, and the doors slammed shut, cutting off the extra ears, the emperor jumped up with hysterical screams. Almost with tears in his eyes, like a child, he took Henrietta in his hand, feeling sorry for him about Baron Wilton and how much he missed him. This time, that monarch convinced the emperor to build a bronze statue of the former emperor. Continuing to openly whine, he wondered what was wrong with the baron's finances. Why is he bothering him with this? The heroine looked around, having heard enough of this. The faces of the rest of the family members were calm and not at all impressed. It turns out that everyone except her had time to get used to it. That is, such behavior is quite typical for him. Suddenly, he noticed the return of his son. Kian greeted his father with the words that today he really causes pity, in a special way. All that was enough for the emperor to make a short remark to follow the words, however, spoken in a rather hysterical tone. If you think about it, in the original version, the imperial figure was like that, untalented and weak-willed. This person was someone who was completely unsuited to the position of a supreme ruler. Henriette, having listened to this almost incoherent stream of complaints, squeezed the emperor's hand as a calming gesture, promising to personally look into the matter. Since the baron opposed the emperor's decree, the duke will confiscate his territory, and the statue can be erected. Even from her point of view, as the author from whose head these people were formed, the emperor's behavior still looked like overkill. So cloying and hyperbolic that it seemed that this empire was still holding up well with such and such a monarch. Henriette, in this context, was like the eminence grise, who was given the greatest responsibility for controlling the empire so that it all did not fall apart. But still, now, he looks even more like a nanny for the emperor. Kian leaned towards her, offering to sneak away to see the rest of the palace, since it seemed like the conversation would drag on long enough. They held hands as they walked through the corridors, starting in the part of the palace in which they were located. The duke's estate was also unusual, but this door really gave the impression of a palace in the classical concept of the word, and the most magnificent. All this gold, high ceilings, light walls decorated with so many details that it hurt your eyes. Rosette carefully asked Kian if his father was always like this. The child of the maid entered the throne, and later gave all the rights to the crown to his son. And this is not luck at all, but the hand of the duke. It is for this reason that the emperor relies so much on him. She was amused by the conspiratorial nature of their conversation, as if they were gossiping. But still, Kian, the way his son expressed himself in such a way about his own father, was strange for the heroine, for whom her parent was an authority and a model. They turned in the other direction, and the boy led her to a place full of madness. It housed paintings and sculptures of the imperial family, as well as portraits of all generations of the imperial family. Rosetta saw mentions of these paintings in the book, and she was very impressed by their appearance in reality. These were works of very famous authors. Her attention was drawn to the image of a boy with blonde hair and clear blue eyes. She asked who it was, and Kian answered as if it was something obvious that it was him. The heroine froze in incomprehension, and he asked in an eerie tone whether it seemed to her that the boy now looked different than in the picture. He carefully but demandingly grabbed her hand, asking several more times, their two figures casting a shadow on the portrait. Her silence was obvious. Just as he thought, Rosette saw the real him. The girl pulled her hand away from his grip and ran wherever her eyes were stroking. She called her father and brothers with tears, completely not understanding how such things could even happen. Calyx at full speed, without looking around. Seeing the heroine's state, he interrupted himself mid-sentence and shook her, trying to bring her to her senses, still being hostile and resisting being called brother. When Kian came closer, Rosetta hid in fear behind her brother, begging for help. He apologized if his joke was too much, which gave her even more goosebumps. It became clear to her why Henriette didn't recognize him when she asked, and why Kian reacted the way he did to the snow story. He doesn't just have a different appearance from the Imperial family. He is not human at all. She was bothered by why a character appeared that was not in the original, and also with such power. Despite his apologies and attempts to make peace, she screamed more and more, and the scream was desperate, as if she was having a nervous breakdown. For a moment, Calix spread his arms, forming a protective wall for her, and asked His Highness how he dared to offend a member of the Hungarian family. But then he turned around and, in his usual dissatisfied tone, reproached his sister for being foolishly caught again. Kian, nevertheless, came to terms with the heroine's mood, and admitted that today they could not improve their relationship. He assured her that if she thought about him, he promised that he would visit her immediately. And with these words, he retired under the heathers of Rosetta. There was an error in the original, and this had nothing to do with it. Unlike Count Saymond, nothing happened that could in any way become a thread between her and Kian. It was said that the crown prince was himself until the heroine returned to the Hungarian estate. It seemed to her that with such strong changes in the plot as the Inhuman Prince, the ground was crumbling under her feet. The realization itself was terrifying. Even after the boy left, she continued to hold Calix's clothes in a death grip, and then her legs completely gave way, unable to stand from shock. Even though her brother gave her his hand to help her get up, it didn't help much, since her legs were completely weak. He turned and offered to carry her on his back, getting into a comfortable position so she could climb up. After a moment of Rosette trying to get her bearings, his signature behavior showed up again. He carried her on his back, but with a mixed expression on his face, and asking, rather instructing her not to tell anyone about this. Without hesitation, she promised to remain silent. And then it occurred to her what Kiana's real name was. Calix answered not enthusiastically, saying he doesn't know, and why should he be interested in this at all? This was quite typical for him, since his younger brother never paid much attention to others. They soon met the rest of the family. She interrupted her brother's story about the reason that he was carrying her, halfway inserting a laconic explanation that her legs simply hurt, frantically trying to change the subject. Rosetta turned her attention to Avel's presence here. The convocation of the royal knights has been delayed a little, so he can still stay at their estate. He looked very happy at the thought that they could spend more time together. He took her in his arms. Realizing how many people are on her side and care about her well-being, the girl's mood noticeably lifted. Henriette calmly took her from her brother's arms, saying that now they can return home, since his business is finished. Although she tried to reassure him that she could walk on her own, when he held her like that, Rosette felt calmer. She came to her senses and asked the Duke about the name of the crown prince, but the answer was only simple. He doesn't know. She explained this by the fact that they had become such friends, although she had previously shouted throughout the entire corridor that their friendship was dissolved. The point was that no one should be named Lancers of the imperial family. You can't unceremoniously ask them about it themselves. It was strange, because he said that he didn't know, not that he shouldn't know. And given the relationship between the Duke and the Emperor, is this really advisable? The set of facts did not tie together at all, as if artificially. The most inexplicable thing was that everyone not only did not know the name of the crown prince, but rather everyone thought that they did not know his name. Upon hearing this question, Avel and Camelon looked uninterested, and there was nothing in the notes. Aenus, whom the heroine accidentally asked, answered exactly the same, with a memorized remark. And even the people who are involved in the upbringing and education of the crown prince did not answer anything useful, considering exactly the same, taking it as a kind of subtlety of etiquette. All she heard about this was that they became such friends with His Highness. It's wonderful, he's such an outstanding person. Those beautiful blue eyes and golden hair are the symbol of the imperial family. Only in Rosetta's eyes he looked different. The girl didn't even notice how she started sketching herself, having managed to depict her father and brothers in portraits, and last but not least, Kian, the way he was in her eyes. Dark hair with a red tint, deep crimson eyes, and clothes to match. It seemed to consist of one dark color scheme. Raising her head, she saw the impenetrable night in the window, and was surprised at how quickly time flew by. The time had probably already flown by when the servants came and announced the arrival of the hour for sleep. The corridor was dark. She walked along, calling her servants by name, but it was completely quiet, only the curtains swayed in the wind. Each time she was escorted to the room, so now Rosetta didn't even know where the lanterns were. A little further, she suddenly came across the bloody body of a knight. He could hardly breathe. He tried with all his strength to encourage her to run. This seriously frightened the heroine, because the estate is protected by a barrier and magic. The voices of the sign servants sounded, also ragged and exhausted, like that of a knight. They said that they could no longer prevent magic. The killers had invaded. They were trying to defend themselves, but their bodies were immobilized. She should run as fast as she could to the Duke. Along the corridor, there was Calix's room. Near it lay the lifeless bodies of knights with their throats cut. Rosetta rushed there without any hesitation. Hungarian estate is protected by a woman with silver eyes and a veil that covers half of her face. She is the guardian star Henrietta and has an incredibly strong protective field. To destroy it, you must have power over the power that destroys all witchcraft and magic. And this is practically impossible. Only if there is an obvious abyss of greed. Blood already decorated the slightly open doors to the room. She came inside like a hurricane, just at the moment when the killer, with his face covered, was swinging a dagger at Calix, who was pinned to the bed. Rosetta, trying to think as quickly as possible, threw a vase that stood right next to her at the figure in the dark. This did not cause any damage, but it did prevent the killer from delivering the final blow. Calix tried to shout to her to run and call her father for help, but the figure simply hit him against the wall, shutting him up and moved towards the girl. According to him, there was no point in running to Henrietta, because his friend had already gone for his soul. The brother on the bed screamed heartrendingly for something else, uselessly assuring the killer that she had nothing to do with them. But the second one continued his speeches, saying that they should blame their father for this. Probably the girl wanted to live a long life. Can a mouse driven into a corner bite a cat? These were his last words. When he was about to swing for the last blow, sounds were heard as if he was being squeezed from the inside. Completely crushing the organs, blood pours out from everywhere, looking for a way out, and the bones crack. Drops of blood fell on the heroine's face, and like a crimson puddle, there was nothing left in the place where the figure had just hung over her. She immediately rushed to Calix in a state of shock. The girl closed his eyes and pressed him to her, asking him not to look at it with glassy eyes. He lost consciousness in her arms. A voice was heard from behind, disparagingly commenting on how easily children faint from the slightest shock. He continued, saying that he saved them, and she wouldn't even thank her for it. His stream of thoughts, more like a monologue, attempts to address the heroine, who was simply silent, was aimed with all his might at making her look at him. First, he removed the blood, which may have frightened her. He assured her that now she might actually turn in his direction. The owner of the painfully familiar voice was Kian. He stood with a strange brush, seemingly inhuman, with blood dripping from the short one. The boy immediately removed it, leaving only a trail of black smoke in the air. Rosetta sat completely disoriented on the bed, hugging her limp brother. Every word she said came out haltingly, unable to form a clear thought. His answer was that she was in danger. How could he not come? He promised that as soon as she thought about him, the boy would appear immediately. It brought back memories of that drawing and a few quick thoughts, which made it even more frightening. The girl put her brother on the bed and backed away a little, asking what he was. Kian did not give a clear answer. He just leaned closer to her and argued his appearance by saying that he only had in mind to save him, because they were friends. At that moment, she seemed to have an epiphany. This world is protected by guardian stars. There is only one creature called a monster. The only imprint of a curse in this world, the most terrible disaster. He smiled, and fog swirled around. So she understood everything. All that could be heard was his voice, asking if she would now admit that he exists. She wouldn't want her to think otherwise, because all people like her are afraid of him. For them, he is the king of stigmata. From the smoke appeared a figure much taller than the boy she knew. His hair was long, and even his eyes were different. In a novel that is not yet finished, this is the last chapter that remains only in her head, the one who brought this world into a terrible state. The curse was stopped by a god who disappeared from this world. The one who caused all the misfortunes stood in front of her, Finding herself in a novel that existed only on paper, she did not yet know that when he revealed himself, looking at her like that, Rosetta would experience indescribable fear. She screamed and kicked, desperately trying to make him disappear. Touching her and feeling how she trembled, he did not understand the reason for her fear. Now there was no threat worth her attention. Kian dealt with the uninvited guests. Her family is also safe. Perhaps something hurts her? Even her face darkened and acquired a pale tint. She still could not recover from panic. Kian moved further away, keeping his distance for her comfort. The first thing that came to the girl's mind was how he became the crown prince. The real crown prince died several years ago. Kian has lived among people for a long time. At that time, he was in their environment when His Highness became a victim of assassins. Bleeding in his own bed, on the verge of death, he learned that he was not human, and he asked for a favor. This was for his weak-willed father, or for the sake of preserving the imperial family, which was in critical condition. Kian, without delving into motives and subtleties, only followed his request to live in his place and took his place. Because of the kind of contract that was formally drawn up, people see it in this guise. Everyone except her. It was strange, because there was no particular reason why it was her, but if you think about it, the girl also heard the voices of ghost servants that were inaccessible to others. The next question was that no one knew the name of the crown prince. They cannot take upon themselves the names of the dead. Names are the essence of all living things. Even if it is the name of a long-dead person, it is not advisable for someone like Kian to use it. Therefore, he simply made everyone forget him, and then introduced some kind of rule about etiquette and the impermissibility of such things. The heroine was reassured that he did not kill the crown prince and did not hide him somewhere in captivity. And as for those killers, of course he knew who sent them. Henrietta especially has many enemies, but in order to decide on this, a person must be driven into a corner. She immediately remembered the conversation between her father and assistant about how Baron Alpheus was the only one still connected with Count Siemund. They didn't even notice how they were getting closer to each other with every word until Kian was looming over her again. Rosetta still had a lot of questions, mostly regarding why he was offering her friendship. If it was the case that she knew about his true nature, she promised to pretend to be ignorant and not tell anyone about it. But Kian just smiled. That was not the reason at all. His clawed hand became normal when it didn't touch his cheek. He leaned on the bed with one knee, hanging over it, because, on the contrary, he was glad that she knew him for real, and he would like to continue to be friends. The pink strands of her hair slid tenderly between his fingers. He whispered that no one could recognize him for who he is, see his essence. Nobody but her. She was still constrained, and did not say an extra word. As he understood it, this appearance of his was too unusual for her, so the next moment that boy appeared before her again. This form is not much different from his true form, which is the reason he chose it to appear in front of her. But it seems that even so she was afraid. Perhaps the best form would be a crimson butterfly. He again took on the appearance of the boy crown prince. Laying his head on the bed, he himself confirmed his guess out loud. Kian mentally listed his many forms. He said that he would do whatever she wanted, so he asked her to look at him. Rosette gathered her strength and did it, still shaking. As soon as their eyes met, the boy smiled, his usual mischievous and friendly smile, so open, as if emitting light. She knew that he had no intention of harming her, otherwise he would not have tried to please her mood. The girl asked him to remain like this and carefully asked about it. From the very beginning, he had no idea of endangering her. He reinforced this many times when he saved her, and besides, he had just dealt with everyone who wanted to harm her. In his opinion, it is not necessary to do something for each other in order to become friends. Therefore, she should not look too much for reasons. He simply valued communication and spending time together. You could do a lot of things just by being in one space. He convinced her, stroking her hair, that he simply really liked her precisely because of this. He was going to protect her further. Of course, he will understand if she does not want to communicate with him, and he does not appear first, only when she thinks about it. Kian walked away. And when this happens, he will believe that she is no longer afraid of him, so he hopes that he can see her again as soon as possible. With these words, he disappeared, as if he had disappeared into thin air, and only the red specks of his magic remained. Henriette used the blade to deal with the intruders. The killers fell one after another. He was surprised how many people broke into the castle. Avel should be fine. Camelin and Calix are protected, but Rosetta is the one to worry about. One of the knights called out to the master, reporting that the younger children had been found. He immediately took off, while the others removed the corpses and lit the lanterns. In that very room, not moving anywhere, Calix lay unconscious. The girl sat with her head hidden in the ruts. She could barely contain her emotions, and as soon as her father hugged her, she began to sob uncontrollably, feeling safe. A faint smell of blood emanated from Henrietta. The heroine, clinging to his chest, did not realize how she had completely thrown out the emotions that had accumulated, clinging to his chest. She sobbed loudly, and then fell asleep as if she had fainted. The next morning, everything was fine. The corpses of servants and knights were removed. They were buried without much formality. There were some unexpected casualties, but it is said that most of the attackers were killed and 2 were captured. It is assumed that Baron Alpheus sent the attackers. He did everything to bypass Henrietta's magic and his home's defenses. The legs were defeated because they underestimated his skills, including swordsmanship. Avel was also able to repel the attack with the power of defense, and he also had the necessary skills after being a knight, and immediately went to Camelin. They say the 2 of them dealt with everything safely. With the exception of the servants, the biggest victim was Calix. His arm was broken, it was bandaged with a magical seal, and his memory was damaged. He didn't remember anything from yesterday, whether it was good or bad. Rosette's eyes were puffy from crying, but he didn't need to know that. His memories ended right there when she came into his room and threw a vase at that killer's head. She was asked why she went to Calix's room. Even this she would tell about Kiana. There was nothing they could do, so how much she should tell remained in question. It was late. None of the servants came, so she went out into the corridor herself. And all the people there were lying on the floor, bloodied and lifeless. They were lying near her younger brother's room, and she, driven only by adrenaline, threw the vase. With every detail in this story, anger thickened around her because she had to endure this. She continued, saying that he then approached her. Her face became more and more pale, especially until Kiana appeared at the moment. Henriette walked over and squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. Rosette had already explained enough for them. She shouldn't remember such terrible events anymore. After all, she was still a child. He also made such a gesture to Calix, patting him on the head, which noticeably surprised him. His eyes widened, and he didn't know at all how he should react to this. The Duke ordered his assistant, as soon as the estate was in order, to gather all the servants, because they would take revenge on the Baron for this. Eye for an eye. And he told the children to go for treatment and rest. He will most likely have a lot of things to do. Avel immediately jumped in, offering his help, rather insisting that he would help by being helpful enough. Even Camelin did the same, and he and his father left, leaving the younger ones alone. The heroine was glad that there was a magical device for treatment, which Calix needed so much now, and that no one asked her about the details. King of the Stigmata. Yesterday, when she encountered this, she was in a hurry, so she couldn't think properly. The question of the safety of friendship with him and his motives as such was still acute, discussed several times from different sides. Usually, the Stigmata is monsters without self-knowledge. They cannot exist on a par with their king. Among her guesses to the question, why me, there was also the thought that perhaps he knew about the original novel. Now the narrative is very confused. Initially, the Stigmata Rabbit was a character in the last chapters, and the most significant villain who appeared first was 18-year-old Avel. But that was still about 3 years away. Next in the chain came Camelin and Calix, and the last, final boss is Henriette. He called upon the king of the Stigmata, and because of him there came a sad end when the whole world perished. Thinking about this, she remembered Kian's words that he would not appear first, but her thoughts could cause him. Rosetta shook her head frantically, trying to convince herself that this didn't count, because her reasoning concerned only the sequence of the plot. Calix asked why she wasn't scared yesterday. Having received the answer that he was in danger, the brother began to scold her. It was very reckless, because she also put herself in danger. There is no protection on her yet. What she should have done was call her father. She felt sad, of course. Her actions did not help in any way, but at least she tried to throw away her fear, going beyond her strength to help. This was incomprehensible to Calix, because from the very beginning he had protection on him, which meant that in any case, everything would be fine with him. In response to this, the girl shouted because they were family. Calix himself may not think so, but the heroine tried to convey her thoughts to him under the disapproving, interjected confessions of her brother. He doesn't like annoying people, and initially there were many in their house who wanted to use the boy by deceiving him. The conversation continued in the direction that the heroine was simply teasing him. Even if he doesn't like her as a person, he must feel some gratitude. What caused only the color on the boy's face? Calix is rude, but he doesn't know how to lie. Now she was surprised how she had not noticed this before. He hardly uttered a word of gratitude, and then with his share of dissatisfaction. I wonder how he will react when he receives the drawing. His portrait, where he is depicted with a characteristic angry expression on his face completely twisted in irritation. She told her brother that she had something for him. The doctor examined Rosetta. After carefully examining the girl's condition, he told her father that it had improved noticeably, but it must be because of the fright that day that she was constantly having nightmares. When this happens, family members should help feel safe. Henriette picked her up and asked if she still had a nightmare today. The answer was not simply yes. The truth was that such dreams had not stopped since that day. In her dreams, she relives the events of that night several times. Sometimes she or Calix is killed before her eyes. At some point, faceless people not connected with that day appear and condemn her, and many threw stones at her past. Henriette lately. She suggested this to Calix too, but his reaction was obvious. He rejected this with irritation because he is not a child. Rosette asked her father if it would be uncomfortable for him to sleep in the same bed with her. But what inconvenience can there be from a small child on a large bed, as he reassured her. Since she couldn't sleep, he suggested singing a lullaby. He began to sing low notes, songs about the beauty of the sounds around him, but already on the second sentence the girl interrupted him, saying that he was doing it wrong again. After that, she offered to sing on her own. A voice, in a dream, asked her if she could promise him that she would definitely return to where he was. He continued his speech despite her screams. If she dies, it will only be before his eyes. If he lives, it will be only before his eyes. If he can't promise him. After that, Rosetta woke up. Sharply, feeling a burden on her soul, although she did not remember the very content of the dream. Henriette was asleep. After thinking a little, she put on her slippers and got out of bed. Although it was night, it was so light outside. Henriette increased the magic even more. She went out onto the balcony and decided to call Kian for a conversation. Ideally, she didn't want this, but if she couldn't escape reality, it was better to face it. As soon as he uttered his name, streams of magic swirled around, and a boy appeared in front of her, with an apple in his hand. He was addicted to calling her little friend, which he did at every opportunity. Kian handed the fruit to her, causing confusion. After that day in the garden, he must have thought that she loved these fruits. Noticing the slightest change in the expression of her face, he asked what was more in her taste in this case. He met his friend once, but she did not share such enthusiasm. Although at first the boy arrived in high spirits, now his mood had noticeably dropped. Somewhere in the distance of the tiers in front of the estate, strange shadows could be seen. Something similar, like fetters, wrapped itself around the figure of Kian, and the apple fell from her hands. The nickname King of the Stigmata also referred to the fact how the stigmata always followed him. The fortified barrier, which Henriette Hungary, the strongest magician currently, had been strengthening for several years, stopped working overnight. She knew what this was, and exactly at this moment she thought that she was ready. But now, standing in front of him, it was not her body that trembled. Rosetta reminded him of the offer to become friends and asked if it was valid. A lot has already changed compared to what she knew about the novel, so maybe this is possible. She offered Kian a deal. Friends value each other, so her condition was to promise that if he became her friend, he would not harm anyone. Perhaps there will be a reason why she cannot immediately call him. Having become her friend, he must not harm the people around her, that is, ghosts, knights, servants, and family members. Kian agreed without hesitation to do as she wished. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. Therefore, she should not be afraid of him, as he assured if she called him, the boy would come anywhere, listen to anything, and also take care of her. He just asked not to get tired of him, as he is attentive. He continued, saying it's okay if she doesn't take care of Kiana in return. He gave Rosette permission to harm him and treat him the way she wanted. This suggested that perhaps the end of this world as she knew it would change. She was overcome by doubts about how trustworthy the assurances were. Suddenly, the door to the balcony opened, and Henriette stood there, looking completely confused as to why the Crown Prince was there in the middle of the night. Kian, without hesitation, with a snap of his fingers, carried out some machinations that discolored everything around and made her father freeze in place. This led to the conclusion that the heroine actually received the most powerful guardian star. Remember, just now, everyone was forced to sleep, but only she did not succumb to these spells. He jumped onto the stone railing, asking if her family would offend her in the future, to immediately tell him about it. He calmly eliminates them all. Rosette reminded him of his promise to her not to harm anyone around her. He brushed it aside, saying that if it's not his opinion, he'll be there someday to change. But then he obediently disappeared, leaving behind a promise to meet again. This time, Henriette opened the door again, wondering what she was doing alone on the balcony at such a time. He seemed to have forgotten what happened a few moments ago. The girl explained that she had a nightmare and she just wanted to get some air, also apologizing for going out on her own without asking. The Duke picked her up, fully allowing this version, and she can walk wherever she wants on this estate, but it is advisable not to disappear one night. If she suddenly has a nightmare, she should wake him up. The father did not want to sleep peacefully while his daughter was tormented by nightmares. He carried her back to bed in his arms, and Rosetta clung to it, convincing herself that everything would be fine, time after time. Last summer, from this day on, she will live in the Hungarian estate in the capital. In words, it was only an estate, but in reality, it turned out to be almost a true palace, with architecture to match the imperial castle. They say that within a few days there will be a celebration of the emperor's birthday, Calix. In contrast to the rest of the family giggling, Calix was straightforward, saying that the celebration is just an excuse and she is pretending, or the truth does not know about the real reason. The servants laughed at this scene. At the sight of the completely confused heroine, Faina leaned closer, explaining that they were talking about her birthday. Until now, she had not given much importance to this, and did not particularly care about anything of this kind until her family appeared in her life. Therefore, she completely forgot about her own birthday, and these people remembered what warmed her soul. The banquet on the occasion of her birthday will be held at the Imperial Palace along with the awakening ceremony, so she will need to take part in this. They talked about it so simply and casually, saying how long it had been since their family had held banquets, as if the Imperial Palace, that is, the greatest power of the empire, were ordinary neighbors to them. Although, if you look at the relationship between the crown and the duke, it would be quite appropriate to say so. Also, the fact that they would be going to the Imperial Palace meant that she would meet Kian again, the topic of which was still vaguely hanging over her. Henriette stroked her head, which was still strange for her sons, forcing them to look at this sight. He said once again not to worry about anything. It's better to think about the gift she would like to receive. The brothers picked up this topic, asking her, even if her desired thing is intangible. Calix replied that it is possible that if she says, he will think about it. This was completely unexpected for her. Therefore, the heroine promised to think about it and immediately give them an answer. In this case, Camelon, emitting light, suggested going to look around. After all, they came to the capital. There was so much to see, what they would like and what to buy. It was a worthwhile idea, since it was her first time here. Henriette wanted to go together, but suddenly the assistant announced that a message had arrived from the Duke of Eldor. This required his personal attention. Therefore, they went for a walk in the capital themselves, taking several guards. They wandered between Gothic temples, whose spires towered over houses and stalls full of delicious food. The streets were full of people, colorful flags and confetti. This provided excitement for any child. Rosetta was beside herself with delight. She and Avel ate kebabs on a stick, saying that if he had known about her interest in this earlier, he would have brought her here long ago. Cammy and I looked at the sights around, and Calix was forced, almost constantly, to run with her hand. The brothers offered her mountains of huge packages with gifts, which she so frantically refused that her hands soon became numb. This festival will last for several days. Usually the emperor's birthday passes until the next day after the dance ball, but since this year Rosetta is also celebrating with them, the Duke decided to extend the celebration time. Camillin added that, by the way, her classmates from the academy would also come to the banquet, for which he received Avel's disapproval, saying that it was boring for the girl, but he just wanted to show off his sister, who is much nicer than their younger ones. Henriette was also contacted by the Duke of Elidor. This situation became the reason for intense discussions. One thought that their relationship was bad. The younger one interjected, "Wasn't the relationship of the three dukes always lousy?" Avel, however, remembers how they often saw each other in childhood until the duke's son was born. He is the same age as Rosetta. She immediately recognized this name. Young Mr. Eliodor is the main character of the novel. Northern Hungary, Western Baskal, and Southern Eljador. These are the three duchies that existed from the very foundation of the Gelt Empire. The main families in the novel, the pillars of power, and the highest aristocracy. The main characters are the heirs of two duchies, and they were hindered by a third, a villainous figure in the plot, the Hungarian family. Three main forces are opposed to each other due to the proceedings, which led to the end that the girl described. Rosetta immediately became interested in what the main character of the story would be like with such strong changes in the plot. She asked her brothers about this, arguing her interest by saying that if she was the same age, she would like to make friends with him. In fact, due to dramatic changes in events that are now beyond her control, it will be simple and beneficial and useful for her to get closer to the central figure. Besides, now she is among the villains. Brothers, in response to this, all start the same thing. Does she need more friends when she has such wonderful, cheerful, and caring ones? Even Calyx joined in, as if not wanting to share her with anyone. Cammy picked her up, telling her that if she was bored with them, they would show her something fun. For the sake of this idea, they brought her to the wasteland, which was a very strange decision. In the middle of it stood a huge stone, twice the height of a man. Avel, as if at the performance showed how strong he is, the whole said, and then he simply clenched his fist, and in one breath crushed that huge boulder into smithereens. With the air of a hero, he began to expect praise from Rosetta and her impressions of his power. The blessing that Avel received was physical strength that is tens of times greater than the capabilities of an ordinary person, and a strong body that is not harmed by either poison or metal. In the novel, thanks to his strength, he destroyed many territories. After receiving delight, he awkwardly scratched his head, explaining that he just wanted to talk about his abilities since Rosetta was about to have her awakening ceremony. Cammy didn't believe a single word, but he also wanted to prove himself. His blessing is difficult to use alone, but it is a fairly crowded place. As soon as he saw a random passerby, and he was at the other end of the square, he called to help. As soon as their eyes met, Cammy ordered the passerby to raise his two hands up and bend them down, which the stranger did, as if hypnotized. 3 steps forward and 2 back, then 5 forward again. He got carried away, sincerely showing off his skills. Camillin's blessing is Eyes of 1,000. Sid, with the help of which he can force anyone, be it an opponent or just a person passing by, to do what he wishes, by just one look into the eyes. She was delighted with how easily and simply he used them. He could show even more, but that was enough. Rosette just wanted him to tell the man to go further where he was going. Years later, in the story, Camillin used his blessing to destroy enemy forces, and he also separated the main characters. But the most serious thing was the fall of the imperial family. This is a huge power, but there is one condition, which, at the same time, is a limitation. It consisted of the need to establish eye contact with the subject. For balance, its power does not affect people who have received protection or higher beings such as Henriette. He let the man go, wishing him a good journey, who was left confused. Although there were knights and servants nearby, Cammy used the bridge of a passing stranger. But such were the subtleties of his ability. Trust between allies is important. And to use power, you need to be sure that no one knows about it. Use it in such a way that no one will guess. He explained it in a conspiratorial whisper, and to Rosetta it all made sense. When it was the younger one's turn, he refused. Returning from the tower, he took possession of her, but still did not want to show it, perhaps fearing that the heroine would be scared. The blessings that exist are countless. There are rare ones, and there are also those that the owners cannot control. For such cases, there is a tower, a place that helps one cope with one's own blessing. If he has such a blessing, he may not want to use it since he will only learn how to use it, so she insisted that little brother doesn't have to do it if he doesn't want to. The topic immediately changed. He was unhappy why she called him that if she was the P here. In her sweetest voice, Rosetta suggested that they come up with the same cute nickname for him, since he doesn't like the one he has now. He sincerely supported this turn of the conversation, but the other brothers could not be stopped. Come to think of it, he was the only one who still didn't have a nickname. Due to the combination of unspoken names, it was difficult to come up with something suitable for his name. As a result, what came out was a laconic shoo-shoo. Avel and Camelon almost doubled over with laughter. These nicknames wonderfully reflected the identity of the younger one. The night told them that the sun would set soon. They were surprised by how much time had passed, so they decided to stop at a toy store on the way home and buy some gifts. Huge towers of boxes with her gifts, each as tall as she was, were slightly hidden behind the word. The fact that the brothers were not enough impressed the girl. They asked her at the banquet not to play with any strange children, but to stay close to them. Among the shelves full of toys, her brothers offered her toys, completely different ones, from polar bears to carousels. Camelon and Calix were arguing about which was better, a pink item that suited Rosetta, or a top that matched her eyes. Seeing this picture, it was obvious that this was a protracted, long process. The girl asked the servant if there was a place where she could sit. The woman replied that she saw a place that looked like a recreation room. She volunteered to accompany the lady. Faina, in turn, went to inform the young gentleman about this and look for something to drink. Rosetta and the virtuous maid commented on her brother's generosity. It wasn't the opinion that they just wanted to find something she would like. The restroom was dim. The girl didn't have time to come to her senses when she noticed an unfamiliar shadow right behind her. The next moment, a cloth was covered over her mouth. A conversation took place in the Duke's office between Henrietta and another Duke. On the panel, made with magic, was the smiling face of Eliodor. He said that this time he would not be able to attend the banquet on the occasion of His Majesty's birthday. They had not seen each other for a long time, and he was sorry, but nothing could be done about it. Henriette looked completely uninterested and cold during the conversation, as his interlocutor made comments about. They had such different characters. When 7 years ago he was looking for a place to leave the newly born Rosetta, the options included 2 other duchies. But, at that time, Eliodor spent more time on the battlefield than at home, and the Duchess of Baskel confined herself at home, taking care of family affairs. Although the 3 of them have known each other for a long time, at that time any connection between them was lost. That is why he decided to give his daughter to Count Simond, who also had a daughter at that time, taking advantage of his power. Thinking about it now, he had a huge number of different thoughts. The Duke of Elgador, that Henriette has found his lost daughter. He did not skimp on his emotions, congratulating his friend from the bottom of his heart. Also, among this tirade, he mentioned his son, her peer, and wanted to offer something, but the second one cut off their connection. Camelon and Calix ran after him. With the only message, from the other end of the corridor, they shouted that Rosetta was missing. The girl woke up in some spacious wooden room, externally passing through a warehouse. 3 unfamiliar figures stood further, talking, fragments of which floated to her in indecipherable combinations of symbols. She was tied hand and foot, as was the servant, Mealy. The conversations of the figures became clearer. They were saying that the store was currently in delivery period, so the back door was open. No one even had to make an effort to kidnap. One just walked in and caught it. They planned to pay a ransom for the girl, but their reasoning was limited, since they had no idea what kind of family she was from. They paid attention only to superficial signs, such as the escort of servants and her clothing, which told them that she belonged to the nobility. All 3 approached her when they realized that the girl had come to her senses. Their faces were painfully self-confident, although fundamentally they were simply kidnapping random children from a store without much investigation, which could easily lead to a conflict on socio-political grounds. One of them was covered in soot and seemed to be taking a dominant position, while the rest just chuckled and assented from the side. He told her, even if she was scared, not to cry as he hated noise. Rosetta, trying to somehow resolve the situation, asked to be released in exchange for her silence regarding them and their activities. Of course, it didn't make much of an impression on the kidnappers, and her next phrase sounded like a threat. They had better let the girl go quickly, because she is the daughter of the Duke of Hungary. The brothers reported to their father. According to reports, she disappeared when one of the servants went to get water. Another servant disappeared with her. They say someone saw someone similar to them being dragged deeper into the alley. Avel has taken guard and is searching the surrounding area, but there is no news yet. Camelon salooned his head, fully admitting his guilt. They should have looked after their sister better. Henriette cut short their self-justification, as he called it, and ordered an assistant to contact the palace, let them mobilize the imperial army, and the Duke would personally command it. If someone is found to have started before him, let him bring him to him alive. The kidnapper may be barely alive. It makes no difference at all. He gave this order as he put on his cloak as he walked. The assistant thought that whoever it was should die before falling into the hands of the Duke. Rosetta's words about her true origin caused laughter among the three men. They considered it just a bait to outwit. Feigning theatrical sympathy, their leader told the others, as if seeking support, that they miraculously knew about only the Duke's 3 sons. There was no talk about any girl. This meant that no one knew about it except the aristocracy from the capital. The mood of one of them immediately changed, tired of unnecessary objections from their victim. The 3 left to report their catch to their boss. Already at the door, they threw out a few phrases about how if she really was the daughter of some particularly cautious aristocrat, the situation could take an unsafe turn. In that case, they should shut her up and kill her. After this, Rosetta realized that the truth was even more dangerous in her situation than the version that the criminals believed. There weren't really any options left, she called Kian. He immediately appeared. This time he crawled out from her own shadow. He resumed his obliging posture, leaning slightly forward, legs in perfect position relative to the etiquette of a worthy crown prince, and hand outstretched. He was ready to help her. The only question was how she wanted him to do it. Crowds of knights and other guards scurried along the streets of the city. This worried ordinary residents. Several people who came under suspicion were tied up, and Camelon loomed over them, interrogating them using his powers. As expected, the kidnappers were quickly overtaken by a wave of information about how the entire city was being combed. The chief wanted to take the girl away first, still not fully believing her words. In the place where she had previously sat near the boxes, there was only emptiness. Kian carried her somewhere, deep into the voluminous flower beds that stretch for many hectares into the distance. Imperial Garden. He showed up quickly so she wasn't hurt. At this point, he wondered, wouldn't it have been better to just kill everyone? Then they would have problems, since Rosette would be the last one to be with them before they died. But in this case, he could just do everything carefully, without leaving any traces. Although she simply didn't like it when people get tired, she told the boy that he just shouldn't do it, explaining it with a vague, "It'll be better that way." Next, she demanded that the shadow and her servant Meili stretch out. Kian's answer was emotionless regret, saying that he had devoured her, unfortunately and by accident. Rosetta didn't understand whether it was true or his stupid joke, but nevertheless, she was inclined to the second, which brought tears to her eyes. The boy immediately apologized and wiped the moisture from her face with his fingertips, explaining that if the servant saw him, it would become a problem, so it would be better if she remained unconscious a little longer. As an apology, he offered to show her something good. Having grabbed his hand, the girl did not have time to understand what had happened, when suddenly she found herself in the middle of a luxurious structure with bridges and platforms. This place was called the Secret Garden. It was different from the Imperial Garden where they had just been. Its atmosphere and architecture was more likely to lean towards a more ornate version of the glass greenhouse on the Hungarian estate. Kian extended his hand to Rosetta's face, drawing her attention to the beauty around her. There are still so many flowers. One of the petals fell on his hand and immediately burned to ashes. To distract her from this sight, the boy leaned closer and touched her forehead with his lips. His lips were very cold. She began to rub her forehead as soon as he pulled away, which genuinely amused Kian. Her reaction was truly hilarious. He did not follow the paths of that garden, and although it was already late and her family must be worried, she could not refuse him a walk inside. What made it especially difficult was his help. All the time she wanted to return to her family, he suggested more and more new places worth seeing. The criminals were caught. They screamed heart-rendingly in the middle of the hall, while a man with a sword was moving towards them. They desperately made excuses with all their might, but Avel's emotions took over with every word. He was stopped one step away from murder by his father, who entered the room and ordered his son not to behave rashly. The interrogation is not over yet, and Henriette himself did not give permission to execute them, so Avel should pull himself together. An assistant named Avel brought Camelon. He, using his powers, penetrated into the consciousness of one of the criminals. Inside, he found only confirmation of the words. So they weren't officially lying, unless stronger magic was used, but that's out of the question. The assistant asked what he should do with them, since they were no longer of any use. At first, Henriette's response was simply to take him away and kill him. But then he remembered how his daughter asked her worst offender to be tried according to the law. Calix also joined in the search. He offered to use his power to search for Rosetta, which impressed his brothers. The Duke thought for a while, looking at him, as if appraising him, and then spoke. If he can control his strength, then good, but if he can't, then this is not a situation where he can overdo it. Calix remembered his sister's furious attempts to get closer, to show that she was safe and he was ready. Fully confident that he could do it, the boy left the room. On the freshly mowed lawn, his legs danced something reminiscent of acceleration taken before running. Horns appeared on Calix's head, milky and green, which matched the color of his eyes. In the evening, when the sun was no longer visible on the horizon, this garden shone. It really shone, with different colors, like a kaleidoscope. Kian confidently led her to different places, and each seemed more beautiful than the last. One moment, they were eating fruits from a tree, which themselves seemed like a cosmic luminary. The next, her dress was blowing in the wind among the tulips. It was all so mesmerizingly beautiful. Her heart especially skipped a beat when they approached the edge of the slope, from where the full moon was clearly visible, illuminating the lonely trees. She wondered if the garden was too big. The fact is that now they were in the space that Kian created with the help of magic. While he stayed here, he slowly decorated it to relieve boredom. Rosetta. The king of Stigmata was amused by this hobby. If he likes to decorate the garden in his free time, then this is a very good thing. This is a special place that only those he personally allows can enter, which is why it is called the Secret Garden. The girl thanked Kian for showing her such a beautiful and secret place, and she did not have the opportunity to say this before, but she's also grateful for the rescue from Meili. She made another attempt to insist on returning, since they had already seen everything. This time, Kian agreed. Taking her hand, he moved them to the Imperial Garden, explaining that there are people there who are not looking, and so as not to miss them, they can stay here and play with others. He used that loophole again to spend as much time together as possible, but she couldn't come back on her own, and since her family would find her here soon, why not stay a little longer? They sat together in the middle of a huge cluster of flowers of different shades. Kian, seeing her delight, took one, the pink one, that most suited her and attached it to her hair. Then Rosetta tucked one behind his ear, red like the color of his eyes. His expression at that moment amused the girl, and she laughed, saying that if he had long hair like hers, she could weave flowers into it. Since she liked long hair so much, he instantly made it even longer than the heroine's. They sat together on that lawn, while Rosetta braided flowers into his braid. She selected the most beautiful ones that reminded him of him. The result was very beautiful. In its charcoal strands, there was a scattering of red buds interspersed with white. She also admitted this. Kian asked if he should continue to be like this if she likes it so much, because he wants to look so that it is pleasing to her eyes. If you think about it, in the guise of the king of the Stigmata, he looked quite frightening. She asked what his true appearance was then, despite the fact that she liked him. The appearance with which she singled him out that night was closest to the truth. Then she cried. And besides, there were too many shocks at that time. The adrenaline in her blood did not allow her to think soberly, so she did not see it properly. Only her long hair was imprinted in her memory. He said that he could take on any form he wanted, but now he most wanted to look like the one she would most like to look at. Among its forms, there are also very scary and disgusting ones. He probably shouldn't show it unless she wants to. She refused such pleasure, considering how he himself described his appearance. Instead, she wondered if this form was one among others, then which one was the number, or offered to show her other appearances, for example. In the next moment, it was not her father who appeared in front of her, or rather Kian, completely repeating the Duke's appearance. and the voice turned out to be appropriate. He smiled strangely and uncharacteristically for her father. Then Avel was holding her hands among the flowers. When she met him, he was in the form of Kian, and she thought of him only as Kian, that boy with black hair. Now she knew that he was capable of turning into anyone from her environment and speaking with voices. This awareness created a strange new feeling that made her body crawl. He then turned Camelin and Calix. To both of them, especially his younger brother and Henrietta, Kian's mannerisms looked strange as she described her impressions. He turned to her father again and said that it would be better if he could become her protector from the very beginning. She, grasping the context, reminded him of his promise not to harm any of her family members. Her intelligence was a trait that particularly attracted him. Of course, that thought was just a quick idea, nothing more. He always obeyed it. Instead, he asked which look seemed best to her. Rosetta almost said what she was thinking. She stopped herself mid-sentence when she wanted to say that, no matter how you look at it, they were all scary. This upset him. No matter what he did, it scared her. Because of this sadness, he turned into a sphere with shadows, similar to a stone. It seemed cute, but so fragile. She, trying to make amends for the situation, asked if she could touch him. After this, Kian caught her interest in small things and changed his appearance again. Before her finger could reach the stone, a coal-colored fox was already standing in front of her. It was the image of the creature that he had seen before. Although it was inconvenient to stay in the form of a four-legged animal, still, if she liked it so much, he could stay like that for a little while. In exchange for a promise, he sees each other more often. She carried him in her arms because she found his appearance incredibly cute. Of course he's adorable, but she asked if he was crying too loudly, to which he replied that it wasn't him. Suddenly, a scream was heard from the garden. Someone announced the discovery. People came out from the building further along the path, and something large was sitting on the roof. She managed to get scared, because in appearance it looked like stigmata, but Kian calmed her down, since these were not demons, but people who came for her. The fox jumped from her arms if they had already arrived, and she was now safe. He should leave. He again took on that shadow form and promised to leave the maid in a suitable place. She suddenly noticed the rapidly approaching stigmata of a man at the top. When they came into the light so that she could see them more clearly, Camelin became visible. Henriette took off running and immediately picked her up in his trembling arms. His voice cracked as he told her how much he was worried. Nikki had never cared about her this much before, so even though she wasn't worried, she couldn't believe it. He carried her in his arms, and she was frightened by the sight of that stigmata up close. She asked her father about this, but in response the creature itself disapprovingly asked who she called it. Stigmata called her a pea, as Calix did. Looking at the huge creature with pink fur and strange horns, it was difficult to say that this was her brother Shushu. Even in this form, she could somehow call him that. Camelin rushed towards them. Everyone who was behind them was ordered to stand. It turns out that Henriette mobilized the Hungarian Guard and the Imperial Guard, all of them, to search for her alone. The father decided to postpone the conversations until later, when they returned home. Everyone, Cora Henrietta, who still needed to disband the guard, sat awkwardly in silence in the living room with green sofas. Calix didn't like her look, but at the root of it, she just wanted to thank her brother for saving her. The guardian star of Calix is the sage who broke the taboos. They say he was a great researcher in the field of stigmata. She was so surprised because that form really looked like a creature, but that was precisely its strength. But there were side effects. It was because of them that he quit training at the academy and went to the tower to learn how to control his power. If he, in this guise, lost control, it would become a big problem. Therefore, he does not really like to use his powers, but for her sake, he did it. As soon as she crossed the threshold of her home, she was examined, and the doctor confirmed that her condition was excellent. But even so, the brothers were still worried, endlessly asking if she was injured and how she was feeling. Henriette entered, sat at the head of the table, and reported that her maid Meili, unconscious, had recently been found near the palace. This made Rosetta feel calmer, although it wasn't that she didn't trust Kinu. She was asked what happened that day. This question caused her confusion, since if she kept silent about Kiana, there would be nothing to tell at all. She started the story from that moment in the toy store, but then she had to lie that she didn't remember anything. Although she was ashamed of this, there was no other choice now. Henriette just leaned closer and said he was just glad she was okay. He added that if he could not find her, he would simply destroy the entire capital. He took this mistake entirely upon himself. His daughter found herself unaccompanied in such narrow streets. From now on, she cannot go out without his accompaniment, and if she leaves the residence, she will be followed by at least 2 people from the servants and security. He next addressed his brothers, calling each by name. Although they have the power to protect themselves, Rosetta is a child who has not yet received her blessing. They must protect her without closing their eyes. After these words, each personally apologized to Rosie, but Henriette continued, forbidding them to wander around the capital without his accompaniment. The girl rarely saw her father really angry, and now it seemed to her that she was in big trouble, but he just scolded her a little. Kidnapping is a big problem. But now, amidst all this, she felt as if they were a real family, without the tense atmosphere that always reigned between its members. And this feeling was strangely pleasant. She and her brothers did not attend the Emperor's birthday banquet because they needed rest. But Rosetta's birthday party would go ahead as planned, so she was told to gain strength. Everyone was so worried, so she almost always lay in bed for 2 days before her birthday. That day the table was set in a special way, and from the very morning there were only greetings on the holiday. Faina led her into the room, which today was chock full of boxes. All these mountains were her gifts. They were sorted. Gifts that were sent by aristocrats from the capital were placed in one pile, and in the other those that were from servants. Henriette left his in the heroine's room. There was such a commotion around. The servant promised to check the rights to the residence and store later. The brothers also appeared in pajamas. They asked if it was worth bringing their gifts now. Avel was focused on real estate, and his surprise was very similar to his father's, and Camelin, in turn, bought a huge amount of dolls and drawing materials. Calyx looked the same as usual. He informed her that in addition to the gifts that he had left in her room, there was also a cart and a pony. He said this in a casual tone, as if he just wanted to make sure that she knew about it. She wanted to open the gifts, but today, there is a banquet, which she completely forgot about, and since this is her first event of this kind, preparation may take a lot of time. But there was nothing to worry about. The servants asked to rely on them in this. Close to evening, the whole family arrived at the imperial palace, which was already full of people in colorful, luxurious outfits. Rosetta was worried about what she should do among all this and how to behave. Henrietta's answer was simple. Whether at a banquet or in other places, she is free to do as she pleases. In addition to this day belonging entirely to her alone, she is also the daughter of the Hungarian family. She can always do whatever she wants. The voice announced the arrival of the Duke of Hungary and his family. Everyone was dressed in the same color scheme, as usual at such celebrations. The older brothers walked with smiles, looking around into the eyes of other people, and only the youngest showed disdain with his entire appearance. The guests around, especially the ladies, intensively discussed the nailed sons of the Duke of Hungary, and then turned their attention to his daughter, whom they saw for the first time in most cases. Rosetta, this evening, was dressed in a dress of the same white and red colors as her family. The sleeves were short, and the corset made the silhouette incredibly graceful. Her hair was braided up, and there was a massive necklace around her neck. Just as the maids had promised, she never regretted relying on them. It was the Cabulet Imperial Hall, crowded with guests. Everything sparkled around, from the crystal chandeliers to the water in the fountain against the backdrop of a stowaway golden ornament. Various people unfamiliar to her approached the Duke. They praised how their sons had grown up, how brilliant the young lady was, and idle conversations about political affairs. The bodies that unconsciously approached and formed a circle, twice as tall as the girl, frightened her with the kind of crush they created. Henriette calmly cut them off, ordering everyone to move away and not make his daughter feel uncomfortable. Whispers immediately spread throughout the hall that the rumors were not lies. The Duke of Hungary truly cares about his child, although some still questioned whether he was faking it. The topic of how he personally gave her the name of the Summer Rose even came up. Everyone agreed that he did not need to pretend in front of them, so they began to notice out loud the girl's nobility. Someone said that if it were his daughter, he would be worried about taking her outside the house with him. Compliments poured in from all sides, sometimes even too cloying and hyperbolic. Although Rosette liked to listen to such flattering words, she still understood that she was only trying to appease Henrietta. He distantly commented on their behavior with too much obviousness from the words. Everyone who has eyes will see what they so vehemently praise. This only caused a new wave of admiration, now almost poetic, which fell on the heather. Avel stood up for her, amid all this shouting, asking everyone to make the situation more comfortable for her. From my sister, still small, and also for the first time in such a place. Therefore, he asked to leave unnecessary conversations for a circle of adults. Let them tell the truth. It seemed to him that Rosetta was uncomfortable with such attention. He reminded her that if someone bothers her, just tell him about it, and his brother will save the girls from the bottom. Millie's brother ran up. She asked where he had gone, to which he reminded her that he had promised to introduce her to his classmates from the academy. Behind him stood two boys who immediately complimented her in the manner of the past, but there was some kind of catch in this. Camelon, radiating light, asked them if Rosie was beautiful, to which they obediently nodded, assenting how lovely she was. It became obvious that he was using his powers, which shocked her how he could do it in such a situation. Calix came up and started complaining about how everyone around them was acting like fools. That girl in the yellow dress said that Rosetta was like a fairy. Count Nelson, they say, was going to give her a yacht, and that Brunette said that he would protect her with his strength. It was strange that he remembered all this. The music started playing, and people started dancing. A voice announced that His Majesty the Emperor and the Crown Prince were coming. They were together in expensive uniforms that emphasized their position in the political hierarchy. While his father was exchanging a few words with the guests, Kian noticed her in the crowd. As soon as their eyes met, he smiled, and it was obvious that he was glad to see her. The Emperor stood near the fountain, in the most prominent place, to announce the speech that would open the evening. He thanked all the guests for their presence. They had gathered here for the sake of someone who had stayed with him for a long time, for the sake of the Duke of Hungary and his daughter. He expressed his sincere congratulations on the 7th birthday of young Mrs. Hungary. After these words, the entire hall was filled with clapping and cheering. From her brothers and her father she heard most clearly. After a second of confusion, she felt much better. So many people congratulated her. Rosetta was much happier than she could have imagined. Suddenly, the thought came to her whether the main character and heroine of the novel had arrived. For the girl's life to be calm, these two must be happy. Therefore, wishing herself strength, she went in search, but, as expected, no one from those two came. While she carefully studied the crowd, half hiding behind the door, her brothers appeared behind her, asking what she was doing now and constantly looking around, because if she was looking for someone, they could help. She found an excuse, saying that she just wanted to make friends with someone, only after which she remembered that it wasn't her brothers who didn't like it. Rosette immediately corrected herself. To be more precise, of course she wanted to play with them, but she didn't want to interfere while they were talking with other people. This, of course, immediately attracted attention to her, but then Camelon asked a difficult question about which of the brothers she liked best, which put her in a stupor. Avel, to begin with, tried to reproach his brother for such a question, but he himself was wondering what the answer would be. This is like the golden apple of Eris from Greek mythology. The one to whom he gave the apple will perceive it as a gift, and the rest will curse and hate. Brothers, of course, will not do that, but still the question was two provoking conflicts. Anyone who does not receive the apple will be upset, and besides, the legend ended with a war. So she could only smile, searching for an answer while they looked at her, eyes painfully thirsty for an answer. Henriette, who approached at that very moment, relieved her of the need to answer. He found such topics of conversation too childish, and Rosetta already had the perfect answer. She understood what he was talking about, and decided that this was the best-case scenario. The girls smiled, and enthusiastically answered that the one whom the family loves the most is Dad, which caused bewilderment of the brothers, but a satisfied smile from the father. Then he curtsied to lean closer, given their difference in height, and offered to dance with her beloved Dad, to which she readily agreed, accepting his hand. Then, at home, at the Hungarian residence in the capital, she fell on the bed, feeling tired but content. Until now, it was just an ordinary day when she was born. The only memories were a kitchen in the twilight and one piece of cake. Suddenly, sounds were heard outside the window, which were strange considering that the room was on the 3rd floor. Someone knocked on the glass, calling himself Rosetta's friend. She immediately realized that it was Kian, and it turned out to be so. They weren't able to talk at the banquet, and besides, today was her birthday. So he also prepared a gift and asked her to close her eyes for a minute. At first she hesitated, but remembering that she had promised to trust him as a friend, she closed her eyelids. A moment later, when he allowed her to open them, they stood together again in the middle of the secret garden where they were last time. This time they were on a certain platform, in the night, although it was quite light. Kian curtsied and asked her to dance. She accepted the hand, and he spun her around unexpectedly quickly, holding her by the waist to keep her safe. Rosetta soon got into the rhythm and was really having fun while dancing. Among her expectations was not at all that he danced so well, but Kian was only glad that she liked it. The girl, laughing, asked if dancing was the gift he was talking about. With a soapy response perhaps, he pressed his lips to her forehead. At first she didn't understand what happened, but then smoke poured out from the kissing area. Kian calmly said that since she liked this garden so much, it was her gift. Now she can come here whenever she wants, at any time. He gives her everything. Moonlight and sunlight, starlight, time in this place, and everything else that is here. This impressed Rosetta, and before she could snap out of her daze and respond, they were back in her room. The boy again sat on her windowsill in the open window and asked if she liked it. The girl didn't know if she could accept it, but Kian convinced her that she could use that garden as she pleased. And then, once again, he congratulated her on her birthday, wished her sweet dreams, and promised to meet later. He hovered in that window, his hair fluttering in the wind for a moment before he disappeared again, as soon as she had time to thank him for it, leaving behind only a red aura, which this time looked like a soft crimson. Rosette lay back on the bed, trying to sleep. There was only a nightlight in the room, and the impressions of the day had not yet faded away. For the first time, she thought about how sad it is when birthdays end. A couple of days later, the festival in the capital also ended, and the kidnapping case was also resolved. They say that Henriette has changed the entire law and order system in the capital. All that remains is to return to the duchy. Camelin asked if Rosetta was taking good care of his gift, while the servants were busy with the suitcases. Henriette was on the side, telling the assistant to. I contacted a certain person because he wanted to stop by the tower on his way home. In the south of the duchy, there is a star tower, a connecting link between people and the guardian stars. There are several of these in the empire, and the one Henriette spoke to is one of them. Hungarian family arrived at their destination by carriage. There they were met by people in cloaks, with identical hexagonal star brooches, the same one adorned on the staff of a woman who stood a little in front of them, as if leading them. The Duke said that they were going to go to the room with the source, and Calix should go and check the condition of his body for any side effects from using the power. The boy tried to convince his father that he was quite all right, but the power of a guardian cannot always be absorbed by people. He had trouble using the blessing before, so he needed to make sure. He was still opposed to this outcome of events, and a woman with a staff intervened, convincing Calix that they had already prepared everything. Therefore, it would not take much time. He reluctantly agreed to this and followed the woman. Rosetta also noticed his reluctance, because it was all so similar to some kind of examination at the doctor. Henriette once again announced that they were going to the room with the source. He asked the girl if it was worth preparing a separate room for her. That room is the place where you can contact your guardian star. That is, not intended for a child who has not yet received his blessing. In exchange for this, she wanted to go look around inside the tower, asking her father about it, promising that she would go with the servants and guards. But she did not suspect that everything would go so far. There were many more people assigned to her than were necessary. Conditions were also set. Do not go beyond the building, and if something happens, immediately contact the Duke. Apparently, this is the result of a kidnapping. Rosetta walked along corridors with high ceilings. She showed Faina fancy lamps, the light source of which was crystals placed in spirals. The tower is connected to all the guardian stars, but they also have a leader. He is called the Sun King, the one who is the guardian star of the novel's protagonist. The girl came across his statue, a man with a spear in his hand and dressed in armor. She asked Faina to bring the flowers that were given to her and placed them at the foot of the sculpture. There is no god in this world. Guardian stars are seers who lived in the past. There are an incurable number of them, completely different in appearance and abilities. Now, all the worship customs of the distant past are gone. Apparently, the reason lies in the world view. Rosette folded her hands in a prayerful gesture and asked for their leader, health and happiness for all members of her family. When they were about to leave, she was made to turn around by a cry that asked her to stand. The next moment, a shock of blonde hair knocked her to the ground, falling with her. A voice was heard addressed to a boy whose name was Lucian. They reproached him for asking him not to run. He raised his blue eyes guiltily, asking for forgiveness. Iverkan was heading towards them, Eliodor with his retinue. He forced the boy, who was obviously the main character, to apologize, and he bowed his head in all sincerity, admitting his guilt. He then offered Rosette his hand to help her up. So far, she has only met the villain and his sons, the villain who beat him as a servant, and the king of the stigmata. After this, when she met the main character, she felt something strange. Hearing the cry, Henriette immediately entered. As soon as Iverkan saw him, he immediately cheered up, and a smile spread across his face with all his teeth. But she had never seen such strongly rolled eyes and an irritated expression on the Duke's face. He immediately, ignoring his old friend, turned around, saying that they had already finished their business, so it was time to return. But Iverkan trailed behind him, saying that seeing this indifference, he knew for sure that he had not imagined it. He kept insisting that it had been 10 years since they last saw each other face to face, without the use of magic or letters. At such a moment, it is worth at least communicating. Then Henrietta's children came into his sight. He remembers Avel when he was still little. He has grown so much during this time. Iverkan continued that he heard he was suspended and believes that after this rest, he will show even more outstanding abilities. Even Rosetta was struck by how loud and talkative the Duke was. He did not stop talking, although he did not receive answers that would contain half the number of words that he managed to use himself. The main character, in all this turmoil, carefully approached her, trying to get to know her. He introduced himself as Lucian, and he was 6 years old, which he showed on his fingers. When the girl introduced herself, he shook her hand with all his might, laughing at the fact that she was a year older. This idyll was interrupted by Calyx, who removed his hands and asked what he was doing. It was clear from his eyes that Lucian was upset. The hero she created was different. In the novel, the protagonist is insensitive, silent, and cold. This was emphasized even by the shades of clothing that he preferred. When he became the new head of the Royal Knights, those belonging to this organization split into 2 camps. Some supported Lucian, who opposed Avel, and others supported Avel himself. Of course, we are talking about the future, and the character may change, given that now he is only a 6-year-old child. But there was one more feature that caught my eye. The girl could not understand whether he was prescribed golden pupils. Iverkan then circled around Henrietta, reproaching him not to be like that, despite the fact that the Duke's face had not changed in any way from that indifferent expression. He called the meeting fate and said on the occasion that he would invite him to visit. Henriette simply answered with indifference that he could do as he wanted. As a result, everyone who rode with him in the carriage suffered a splitting headache after the absence of at least 1 second of silence. He continued to talk incessantly about how, after the birth of his son, his wife saw the King of the Sun in a dream. It was such a significant event that he traveled all over the world in a week and organized a huge festival. It's a pity he couldn't invite his friend. Of the 3 dukes, he has the most energetic character. This was a characteristic feature that she wrote in the novel, but it seems that he was even too frisky. Perhaps it has something to do with his ability. Lucian pulled Rosette by her clothes and called her little sister. At the same time, the faces of the non-brothers were such that they could easily frighten this child. She remembered all their words, that she didn't need anyone but them. If they continue to stay together, they will definitely become doctors, and she doesn't need that for her own well-being. Therefore, she offered to show Lucian the garden, since it was his first time at their estate. Camelin tried to object, but she didn't want to listen to it. The girl reproached their lack of hospitality. It was worth noting the faces with which she greeted the guests. She forbade her brothers to follow them. She led him along the paths of the garden, showing him different parts. The greenhouse, then the rose garden. The boy looked like his father. He noticed the similarity of Rosetta's flowers and hair, and then described the garden that was in his house. She wondered if she should befriend him, given all the future plot developments. The basis for this friendship in words was the friendly relationship between their fathers, and this reason was very much to the boy's liking. Lucian asked what she was doing then, before they collided. The girl explained that she laid flowers on the Sun King's altar and asked for happiness for her family. After this, the atmosphere changed noticeably. He replied that this was impossible because in the event of any offerings, the guardian stars would become like gods. This created a heavy pause between them. The next moment, the boy smiled sweetly again, saying that it doesn't matter. The guardian stars must have received a gift for the first time. They will probably be happy about it. Rosette was still surprised that he knew who the gods were. Lucian explained this by saying that his father had told him about it. 1,000 years ago, such creatures, called gods, lived, but now they do not exist. Well, since the Duke of Elgidor, then he must know for sure that the holy places and faith and divinity and the people who believed in it have all disappeared. According to him, they fell, having lost their name. All that's left is the curse. Kian grabbed her from behind, without his usually mischievous expression on his face. Now his eyes were narrowed, and he looked at Lucian, who sincerely did not understand what was happening. He pulled her hand again, to which Lucian reacted negatively. He introduced himself as her friend, and almost angrily said not to interfere with them playing, to which Kian also angrily replied not to make him laugh. Rosetta found herself between two opposing sides. The two boys grabbed her hands from different sides, wanting her to play only with them. Lucian lunged, saying that little sister should be bigger. How about the crown prince let her go? Kian did not fall for such tricks, but the duke's son did not let up. She didn't understand, since they knew each other, what the problem was in calming down and talking. Having lost the last drops of patience, the girl pulled her hands away from his, raising her voice at them. It was painful and uncomfortable. The two of them immediately started apologizing for the pain they caused. Although they tried to adjust the strength to prevent this from happening, the boys looked really guilty. Rosette agreed to forget about it, but they should apologize to each other and make peace. This statement puzzled them, but she wasn't interested in that. In detail, they needed to shake hands, hug, and say, "Sorry, friend." Of course, they were not eager to do this, but the girl's words that otherwise she would not play with them were quite convincing. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, and the hug did not last even a quarter of a unit of time. Of course, everything was not as it should be, but the main thing is that the two of them built a consensus. Rosetta's brothers arrived there, and the servants told them that there was someone fighting with her. Avel apologized for not noticing the crown prince earlier, but his next words sounded like a full-fledged threat, although syntactically, it was only a question of whether it could be that the mess was because of him. The girl was amazed how they could speak so informally. Camelin hugged her, unceremoniously demanding to confess who exactly had offended her, and Calix commented on the problems that arise with the presence of the prince. Henriette appeared as if to save him. He assessed the situation and dispersed them. He took Rosette away under the pretext that she should personally introduce herself to the Duke. The crown prince must be tired from the trip, and the others were obliged to give the guest a tour. And now she sat in complete peace, eating delicious cakes in the company of the dukes. In that situation, it was the right decision to disband them. Otherwise, the tension would not be amused. But then she should talk to Kian about it. Iverkin was pleased with her appetite and asked if it was tasty. In response, the girl invited him to try it too, which was a touching manifestation of her caring nature, which he appreciated. He had heard rumors, but in real life it was even more amazing. He couldn't believe that Harriet cared about her like that. And he doesn't even deny what made the Duke laugh right in his face, and the other hide his irritation in a mug of tea. But the more Iverkin looked at her, the more she became in his eyes like... And at this word, Henriette cut him off, asking him not to talk nonsense. But what was the stupidity of how much his daughter looked like his wife, her mother? In the novel that Rosetta wrote, there was no one except the 4 rich duchies. The only thing that was known about the Duke's wife was her death, the way she died 7 years ago. There were no people inside the duchy who spoke about her, only quiet whispers regarding the mournful needs of her death, which both quickly outlived their usefulness and ceased. She was interested in finding out what kind of person her mother was, and Iverkin noticed this interest. Despite Henrietta's reproaches, he only smiled and began his story. Her mother was their dear friend. They were close to the academy, and she was like a fairy there, luxurious like a summer rose, light like a spring ray of light, truly a fairy. It was once said that one of these was caught in the Albandel forest. Because of this, even the fairy king himself invaded the academy. The story was strange, But at the time, everyone was interested. Ivercon suddenly revealed information that completely destroyed the girl's ideas about her mother as a model of tenderness. The point was that one day she came after catching the stigmata. Garriott had already covered his face with his hand, emitting waves of discomfort. His wife, as it turned out, was nicknamed the Fairy because she always found herself in such situations. It was as if she was just thinking about how to spoil her today. But even so, no one could deny that she was a genius. She shocked all the teachers by finishing her dissertation at such a young age, and rumors circulated that Garriott had already helped her with it. The Hungarian interrupted him, almost smoking, which is why Ivercon stopped. But for show he said to Rosetta like this, but because of her father he cannot tell her more. The girl immediately left the hall, alone, because they wanted to talk in private. The maids, led by Faina, were waiting for her in the corridor, asking if the lady was going to see her brothers. But she was going to go to the gallery. She was looking for a specific image there. She remembered that day and how that picture was drawn. The whole family poses for the artist. Someone was unhappy with how long they had to stand. Someone teased another that his hair was sticking out. Recently, they painted a portrait of the Hungarian family, with all its members at that moment. The girl asked where they put the one that was hanging there earlier, but they simply moved it. On that canvas were the Duke's sons as children and the living Duchess. Rosetta asked the maids how her mother died. This was obviously quite a hot topic. They immediately began to turn her attention to the bow that was lopsided, new shoes, and the sensations after the journey. But she insisted. To be honest, she had heard rumors in Samon County that the Duke personally killed his wife. The maids immediately reacted, insisting that this was an ugly slander and how Henriette loved the Duchess. She also thought that this was not realistic, but she needed to make sure. After all, she cannot ask family members. Judging by the stories of the servants, it was customary in the Empire to enter into marriages of convenience, but the Duke and Duchess passionately loved each other. They got married after going through many difficulties together. The death of God was a tragedy, but what Rosetta heard was not true. Faina began her story. Maylie tried to cut her off, but it would be better for a lady to know the truth than to be so mistaken. 7 years ago, on that day, it was raining heavily. Most of the servants were busy cleaning up the place because of the rain. There were no signs of trouble, but the stigmata suddenly invaded the estate. According to eyewitnesses, this stigmata was in human form. Among all forms, this creature had high intelligence and was especially strong. The place where it appeared was the mistress's room and the lady's room now. Garriott was in a hurry then, but it was too late. Rosette remembered that dream when she fell asleep in the Duke's room. Dark clouds and rainy night. A black stigmata attacked her from behind, and a silver sword pierced it. It turns out it was a memory. From this, it turns out that the rumors that the Duke was molested are also lies. At that time, he was severely injured in the battle with the creature, and was also too shocked by the death of his mistress. Garriott was unable to take care of his children and had many enemies, so it was dangerous to reveal the truth. In fact, he imprisoned himself, under false pretenses. He sent his daughter to a safe place. She felt better about the truth that her father did not abandon her, and that an unexpected tragedy was to blame. She was the only one who survived that day. The stigmata could not help but harm the child. She was the easiest target. Probably the Duchess and Henriette protected her at such a cost. Faina bent down to be on the same level as the girl. She said how glad they were that Lai was back and brightening their days with her presence. They told her this because they wanted Rosette to know how much the master and mistress loved her and each other. If this upsets her, she can punish the maid, but she must remember how much her parents love her. At night, the girl knocked on her father's room again, asking if they could sleep together again. She told how she became interested in details about her mother and asked the maids. She didn't miss anything about how the Duchess had protected her and how Henriette had suffered back then. In truth, there were many rumors in Samon County, and she asked, gathering her strength, if he hated her because her mother died because of her. Henriette pulled her daughter closer, reassuring her that it was definitely not her fault. There are always those who take pleasure in watching others suffer. You shouldn't pay much attention to their words. He instructed that even if she felt that she was wrong in something, she needed to be confident in herself. And always act as if actions are not right. Her family is always by her side to support and help. Rosetta asked, what if then she becomes ill-mannered? But the answer was simple. Who would dare to tell a girl from the Hungarian family that she was behaving inappropriately? Besides, it is a privilege for children to enjoy. It seemed to her that until that moment she was too emotional, but after hearing Henrietta's words, her soul became calmer. Little did she know, she needed to hear those words now. Henriette then told her to go to bed, saying that staying up late was bad for your health, but she asked him if he would play a lullaby today, reminding him that he had promised to do whatever she wanted. The Duke didn't know how to sing at all. It turns out that earlier he didn't just say that he wouldn't do it anymore. She could hardly contain her laughter, listening to his crooked attempts to hit the notes, but she still liked it. Seeing her reaction, he stopped and put her to bed. The main topic that was running through her head now was that she thought she knew so much about this world, but it turned out the other way around. And also whether these events were written by her in the novel. A lot has happened in recent days. She even forgot about the squabbles between Kian and Lucian, which did not disappear anywhere. It still felt like they were throwing lightning at each other just by looking at each other. Luckily, the brothers were too busy to join. Since they had made peace, which only meant the forced performance of some ritual that was supposed to help them reach a consensus in existing with each other, she suggested playing together. The response to this proposal was rather sluggish. Kian was ready to do so if she wanted it, but Lucian did not constrain himself from describing the frightening appearance of his friend. Rosetta insisted that it was just a face with its own characteristics, which discouraged Kian. All the time, he was tailoring his appearance to her tastes and desires, so that now he could hear it. She turned to Lucian and asked if he had behaved like an adult yesterday. He just blinked his eyes, not understanding the distinctive features of adult behavior. The girl was sure that he did this on purpose. She found it strange, but she did not create special conditions for the actions of the main character in her manuscript. It was hard to know if this was another change to the original plot structure, or if she was missing something. All three were sitting at a table in the garden and drinking tea and cakes. As it seemed, the most favorable atmosphere was fundamentally, but the Duke's son did not shut up from strange and endless questions, the purpose of which was to hit the target, on the nerves. He told how he and Rosetta, whom he stubbornly continued to call little sister, went to the tower and asked the crown prince if he was there. After a negative answer, he assumed that it was because of a bad relationship. The topic of conversation itself was good, but the guardian stars and the stigmata king combined would certainly have a bad relationship. She had to smile until her gums hurt to smooth out the corners. She asked Lucian if he was so passionate about the guardian stars, which one he himself would like to receive. Of course, the girl already knew the answer to this question. The main character was blessed by the Sun King and received a power absolutely similar to him, for which he was nicknamed the Incarnation of the Sun King in the novel. But his answer now was that he wanted to be a huge palace. The boy spread his arms, describing it with delight. The existence of such a guardian star was questionable, but since there are options by which people can turn into stigmata, there is nothing strange about this. He asked the same question back to her. Rosetta had never actually thought much about it. It just occurred to her that she was happy right now, and there was no need for anything special. But if she chose, she would prefer one in order to become healthy and strong. In this regard, she most envied Faina's guardian star. Kian answered cynically, saying that in any case, this is only strength from those who were the same people. A conflict broke out between him again. Lucian had an extremely negative attitude towards such thinking, because in this case the stars would not protect him, towards which the second did not hold back his disdain. The servant, who came to report that the Duke was looking for the young Master Eliodor, stopped the squabble. Due to the fact that Kian was willing to please any desire of Rosetta, a collective decision was made to all go to the palace together. Iverkin reproached his son for inattention, since he warned about the meeting after lunch. It is not often that one gets the chance to meet the Duke of Hungary to neglect such an opportunity. If he wants to become a knight, then it is important for him to gain support. With this thought, the girl and Kian left them. Avel was walking along the same corridor. In the shadows, his face was even more obvious, not characteristically frowning. If you look at it this way, he said that he was on vacation from the Order of Knights, but the Duke then, on the contrary, called it a suspension. It was now difficult for Rosetta to understand what really happened among all these versions.